I stood in the middle of a five-star French restaurant surrounded by the city elite as my own son snatched his late mother's most prized possession from my hands and tossed it into a garbage can. "We do not serve peasant food here," he hissed, making sure his wealthy new in-laws heard every word. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply reached into the trash, retrieved the worn leather journal, and walked out the door. But when I got home and wiped the stains off the cover, the leather split open, revealing a hidden document from 1928 that would soon leave my arrogant son begging on his knees. My name is Julius. I am 69 years old, a retired studio mechanic, and this is the story of how a discarded recipe book destroyed a kingdom built on lies. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that disrespecting your roots always comes with a heavy price. It was a crisp autumn evening when I arrived at the grand opening of Maison de Lumière, the ultra-exclusive French restaurant my son DeAndre had just opened with his wife Audrey. Walking through those heavy glass doors, I felt entirely out of place. The room was a sea of tailored tuxedos, designer silk gowns, and clinking crystal champagne glasses. Audrey's family, a line of wealthy real estate developers, had invited their entire country club circle. The crowd was predominantly white affluent and entirely disconnected from the world DeAndre and I came from. I was wearing my best suit, a charcoal two-piece I had bought a decade ago for church Sundays. I had polished my shoes until my arms ached, making sure I looked as presentable as possible. It was clean and pressed, but next to the bespoke outfits in that room, I might as well have been wearing rags. I did not care about the judgmental glances from Audrey's parents or the snickering from her friends. I was there for my son. In my hands, I held a carefully wrapped package. It was not an expensive bottle of wine or a flashy piece of modern art. It was a worn, grease-stained leather notebook. It was Chorus Recipe Journal. My late wife, DeAndre's mother, had spent her entire life perfecting the southern spices and family secrets written on those fragile pages. She had passed away 3 years ago, and I thought tonight, as he embarked on this culinary journey, giving him the soul of our family's kitchen would be the ultimate blessing. I approached the center of the room where DeAndre was holding court. He wore a custom velvet dinner jacket, a heavy gold watch flashing on his wrist, laughing loudly at a joke made by Audrey's father. He looked like a stranger, a man who had entirely erased his past to manufacture a new identity. When DeAndre saw me walking toward him, his smile vanished instantly. His jaw tightened and he took a quick step forward, clearly trying to intercept me before I could mingle with his high society guests. Audrey stepped right up beside him, her perfectly manicured hand resting on his arm, her eyes scanning my old suit with unconcealed disgust. "What are you doing here, Dad?" DeAndre muttered under his breath, his tone sharp and urgent. "You are supposed to be sitting at the back table near the kitchen." I ignored his hostility and offered a warm smile, holding out the wrapped package. "I came to give you a grand opening gift, son. I figured every great chef needs a little inspiration from home." Audrey let out a soft, mocking laugh that cut through the ambient music. "Oh, Julius," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We have a Michelin-trained chef flown in straight from Paris in the kitchen. I do not think we need any tips on how to boil collard greens or fry catfish." I kept my eyes on DeAndre, ignoring her venom entirely. I unwrapped the brown paper, revealing the old, worn leather cover of Chorus Journal. "Your mother's recipes, DeAndre," I said gently. "The ones she learned from her grandmother. I thought you could keep it in your office. For good luck." DeAndre stared at the book as if I had just handed him a toxic substance. The chatter around us had quieted down. Audrey's parents and their wealthy friends were watching, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. DeAndre's face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and absolute rage. He snatched the journal from my hand so hard the ancient spine cracked audibly. "What kind of humiliating stunt is this?" he hissed through gritted teeth, his voice carrying just enough for the VIP guests to hear. "We serve seared duck and truffle risotto here. We do not serve peasant food." Before I could even process the cruelty of his words, DeAndre turned around and tossed the journal straight into a nearby trash can, used for discarded cocktail napkins and empty lime wedges. The heavy thud of the book hitting the bottom of the metal bin echoed in the sudden silence of the room. He looked back at me, his eyes cold and devoid of any familial love. "Please go sit down and stop embarrassing me in front of my investors," he whispered. I did not raise my voice. I did not cause a scene. At 69 years old, you learn that anger is a cheap emotion and silence is often the sharpest blade. I looked at the son I had raised, a man who had completely erased his heritage to fit into a world of pretenders. I slowly walked over to the trash can. The entire room watched in stunned silence as I reached in, brushing aside damp napkins and sticky fruit rinds, and pulled out Cora's journal. I wiped the cover with the sleeve of my only good suit. As I held that book, a flood of memories washed over me. I remembered Cora standing over a sizzling deep fryer 14 hours a day, the heavy air thick with the smell of paprika and hot oil. Her feet were constantly swollen, her hands perpetually burned by popping grease. She ran a small catering business out of our cramped kitchen, selling fried chicken, mac and cheese, and sweet potato pie to construction workers and church congregations. She did not do it for fun. She did it to pay the exorbitant tuition for DeAndre's elite business school. She sacrificed her health, her youth, and ultimately her life, just so he could wear that velvet jacket and stand in this multi-million-dollar room. And he had just called her life's work peasant food. I tucked the journal securely under my arm. Without looking back at DeAndre, without acknowledging Audrey or her sneering parents, I turned and walked toward the heavy glass doors. DeAndre did not call out to me. He simply turned back to his guests, apologizing for the awkward interruption, pouring more champagne as if I had never existed. I stepped out into the cool night air, leaving his kingdom of lies behind. The cab ride back to my small, quiet neighborhood was a blur of silent reflection. I was not devastated. I was profoundly disappointed, but my mind was remarkably clear. When I walked into my modest living room, I sat down at the kitchen table under the warm glow of the overhead light. I placed Cora's journal in front of me and grabbed a damp cloth to carefully clean the cocktail syrup that had spilled onto the cover when DeAndre threw it away. As I rubbed the worn leather, I noticed the violent throw had done more damage than I initially thought. The thick, rigid spine of the book had split open. Cora had always been protective of this book, telling me it was a family heirloom passed down from her grandfather. I gently pulled the split leather apart to inspect the binding, planning to glue it back together. But as I separated the material, my fingers brushed against something stiff tucked deep inside the hidden lining. It was a folded piece of paper, thick and ancient, completely concealed from the naked eye. My heart skipped a beat. I carefully slid the paper out and unfolded it on the table. It was yellowed with age, the edges brittle and crumbling. At the bottom, stamped with an unmistakable red wax seal, was an official government crest dated 1928. It bore the name of Cora's grandfather. As I read the elegant, faded cursive handwriting, my breath hitched in my throat. This was not a recipe. It was a deed. A permanent, irrevocable land deed to commercial lot 405. The exact piece of land DeAndre and his wealthy father-in-law had just built their lavish French restaurant on. The ringing of my old landline phone shattered the quiet peace of the following morning. I was sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the faded parchment and the broken leather binding of the journal while sipping my black coffee. I let the phone ring 4 times before I finally picked up the receiver. I did not even get a chance to say hello. Audrey's shrill, demanding voice immediately blasted through the speaker. "Julius," she barked, skipping any basic form of human decency or greeting. "DeAndre is too stressed to deal with you right now, so I am handling this." We went vastly over budget on the imported Italian marble for the main dining room, and my father says we need more liquidity to finish the outdoor bar expansion. We need you to bring the deed to your house down to our bank by noon. We are using it as collateral for a commercial line of credit. Do not make a scene, and do not embarrass us again. Just bring the papers and sign where they tell you to sign. I held the phone to my ear, letting her breathtaking arrogance wash over me. She was not asking for a favor. She was issuing a command. Only hours ago, my son had publicly humiliated me and thrown his dead mother's legacy into a garbage can. Now his wife was ordering me to gamble my only home, my sanctuary, to fund their vanity project. They viewed me as nothing more than a disposable resource, a stepping stone to elevate their status in a world that would never truly accept them. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply placed the receiver back onto the cradle, severing the connection in the middle of her next sentence. I had much more important things to do than listen to the demands of a parasite. I carefully placed the fragile 1928 deed and Cora's damaged journal into a hard plastic document case. I put on my coat and walked out the door. I was not heading to their bank. I was heading to the historic district to see a man named Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein was a master appraiser of antiquities and historical documents. His shop was a dusty labyrinth of ancient maps, first edition books and artifacts that held the forgotten secrets of the city. I knew how to handle delicate things. Before I retired, I spent 40 years working as a studio mechanic repairing massive 35mm film projectors and maintaining highly sensitive vintage camera equipment. My hands were trained to be steady to treat fragile materials with the utmost respect and precision. That same mechanical patience is what kept me from tearing the deed when I found it the night before. But I needed a professional to authenticate what I was looking at. When I walked into the shop, the bell above the door chimed softly. Mr. Klein, a man in his late 70s with a thick white beard and sharp, intelligent eyes, greeted me warmly. I placed the plastic case on his velvet-lined counter. I told him I needed an urgent authentication of a document hidden inside a family heirloom. Mr. Klein put on a pair of white cotton gloves and adjusted the magnifying loupe over his right eye. He turned on a bright halogen examination lamp and gently extracted the yellowed parchment using a pair of specialized flat-tipped tweezers. He treated the document with a reverence that DeAndre completely lacked. The shop was dead silent except for the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. I watched as Mr. Klein scrutinized the red wax seal, the faded signatures, and the intricate watermarks embedded in the thick paper. He then opened Chorus leather journal, carefully turning the grease-stained pages filled with her meticulous handwriting. Suddenly his breathing changed. He lowered his magnifying loupe and took a step back. I noticed his gloved hands were actually trembling. "Julius," he whispered, his voice entirely stripped of its usual professional calm. "You have absolutely no idea what you have brought into my shop today." He pointed a shaking finger at the open pages of the recipe journal. "These are not just instructions for fried chicken and stews. Look at the precise measurements of these dry rubs, the chemical breakdown of the brines. I recognize this exact formulation. This is the original proprietary recipe for Southern Heritage Foods." My jaw tightened. Southern Heritage Foods was a massive corporate spice empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. For decades, there had been rumors in the community that the white founders had stolen their billion-dollar flavor profile from a black family in the 1920s, but no one ever had the physical proof. Mr. Klein tapped the fragile pages. "Your wife held the original genesis of a global empire in her kitchen. This book alone is a piece of explosive culinary history. But that is not even the most staggering part," he continued, his voice dropping to a hushed, urgent tone. He moved his finger over to the yellowed parchment with the red wax seal. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. "Julius, this is an ironclad perpetual land deed from 1928. It was issued to a man named Ezekiel Vance, which I assume is your wife's grandfather. The city zoning boundaries have shifted over the last century, but the lot numbers remain legally binding. This document grants your family the permanent, unalienable ownership of commercial lot 405. The numbers echoed in my mind. Lot 405. I felt the air leave my lungs as the magnitude of his words finally registered. Commercial lot 405 was located right in the heart of the newly gentrified arts district. It was the exact premium parcel of real estate where Audrey's father had supposedly purchased the land. It was the exact spot where DeAndre and Audrey had just poured millions of borrowed dollars to build Maison de Lumière. They did not own the land beneath their feet. I did. Through Chorus bloodline, the ground supporting their arrogant kingdom belonged entirely to my family. Audrey's powerful father had likely relied on corrupt city records or shady handshake deals to claim that property, assuming the original black owners had been erased by time and gentrification. They built a towering monument to their own ego right on top of my family's stolen inheritance. Mr. Klein slowly removed his glasses and looked at me with profound gravity. "If you take this to the right lawyer, Julius, you hold the power to completely dismantle whoever is standing on that property right now. This is worth an absolute fortune." I thanked Mr. Klein, paid him for his time, and secured the documents back into the hard plastic case. Walking out of the antique shop, the bright morning sunlight felt completely different. The air tasted sharper. The world around me had entirely shifted on its axis. Just yesterday, I was an old, discarded man, forced to watch his son trample over his mother's memory. Today, I was the sole master of the chessboard. They wanted my small residential house to fund their bar. They had no idea I already owned their entire restaurant. I drove back to my neighborhood feeling a cold, calculated calm wash over me. The time for being the quiet, accommodating father was officially over. I pulled into my driveway and walked inside, locking the heavy deadbolt behind me. I walked straight to the floor safe hidden beneath the rug in my bedroom and securely locked the documents away. Just as the heavy steel dial clicked into place, a violent, aggressive pounding erupted at my front door. The heavy thuds rattled the wooden frame of the house. I walked out to the hallway and looked through the peephole. It was DeAndre. His face was twisted in a mask of furious desperation, his fists hammering against the wood as he screamed for me to open the door and hand over the deed to my house. The trap was set, and my son was walking right into it. I unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the front door open. Before I could even speak, DeAndre shoved his way inside, brushing past me with a violent, frantic energy. He marched straight into the kitchen and slammed a thick stack of stapled legal documents onto my dining table. The pristine white paper looked entirely out of place on the scratched oak surface. "Sign these right now," he demanded, his voice echoing harshly off the walls. He was pacing back and forth, running his hands over his perfectly groomed hair, acting like a cornered animal. "Audrey and I are in serious trouble. Her father is pulling our funding. He found out the restaurant renovations are bleeding money and he is demanding immediate collateral to secure a bridge loan. Your house is the only clean asset we have left to leverage." I stood near the doorway watching him unravel. I walked over to the table and looked at the papers. It was a complete property transfer deed. My son was not asking for a temporary loan or a favor. He was aggressively demanding that I sign over the sole ownership of my home. The house I had paid off decades ago, the very house where his mother and I had built our lives. He wanted to hand the deed directly to his wealthy, ruthless father-in-law to save his own skin. He did not care where I would live or how I would survive. He only cared about maintaining his fragile grip on a luxury lifestyle that was rapidly collapsing around him. "Grab a pen and sign the bottom line," he snapped, pointing a shaking finger at the signature block. "We do not have time to debate this." I did not reach for the pen he shoved toward my chest. I simply stood my ground, staring at the legal documents and then back at his panicked face. "You want me to surrender my home to Audrey's family to pay for your terrible business mistakes?" I asked, my voice remaining dangerously calm. DeAndre slammed his fist against the kitchen table, rattling my ceramic coffee mug. "Do not play games with me, old man," he shouted, his face flushing with a mix of panic and absolute rage. "You humiliated me in front of the most powerful people in this city last night. You showed up looking like a beggar and caused a scene. You are clearly losing your grip on reality. Audrey's father is ready to crush me financially and socially. If you do not sign this deed today, we are going to court." He stepped closer, using his height to try and intimidate me, towering over me with a menacing glare. "Audrey has already spoken to a ruthless family lawyer. We will tell a judge that your mind is slipping. We will testify that you are exhibiting severe signs of dementia and paranoid erratic behavior. We will get a medical mandate to declare you legally incompetent and throw you in a psychiatric facility." The words hung in the air, heavy and toxic. He was willing to strip away my freedom, my dignity, and my sanity just to maintain his fake billionaire lifestyle. He was threatening to lock his own father in a padded room simply to secure a line of credit for a restaurant that served overpriced food to people who hated him. "Once I have legal conservatorship over your estate, I will just sign the house over to myself anyway," he sneered, looking down his nose at me. "You can either sign this paper right now and stay in your home, or you can rot in a state-run mental ward while I sell this place out from under you. Choose." It was a threat delivered with a cold-blooded cruelty that completely shattered the last remaining illusion I had of my son. He was not just arrogant or misguided. He was entirely and ruthlessly corrupted. He viewed my existence as nothing more than a legal hurdle to overcome. He was ready to destroy his own father without a single ounce of hesitation or regret. I looked at the man standing in my kitchen and realized the boy I had raised was completely dead. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. As I stared into his hostile, entitled eyes, a vivid memory surfaced unbidden. I remembered the sweltering summer of his senior year in high school. DeAndre had secured an interview for a prestigious Ivy League business program, but he was terrified they would judge him for his cheap thrift store clothes. I owned a vintage 1969 Chevrolet Impala at the time. I had spent 6 years rebuilding the engine with my own 2 hands, hunting down original parts in scrap yards across the state. It was my absolute pride and joy, a symbol of my hard work. The day before his interview, I drove that car to a private collector, sold it for cash, and walked miles to a high-end tailor to buy him a custom wool suit. I gave up my singular passion so he could walk into that interview feeling like he belonged in their elite world. He wore that suit, and he got the scholarship. Now he was standing in the house I bought with blood and sweat, threatening to lock me in an asylum because I would not surrender the roof over my head. I picked up the pen he had thrown on the table. DeAndre smiled, a smug smirk of arrogant victory spreading across his face. He thought I had surrendered. But instead of signing the deed, I snapped the plastic pen in half and dropped the broken pieces onto the contract. "Get out of my house," I said, my voice dropping to a low, unshakable register. "I am not signing anything, and if you ever threaten me again, you will find out exactly how sharp my mind still is." DeAndre stared at the broken pen, his face pale with absolute shock. He snatched the unsigned documents off the table and stormed out, slamming the front door so hard the framed pictures in the hallway rattled against the wall. The second his car sped out of the driveway, I picked up the phone. I called Mr. Hayes, a ruthless commercial lawyer I had met years ago when I needed help negotiating a pension dispute. I told him I needed a comprehensive forensic audit of every single bank account tied to my name or my late wife's estate immediately. I suspected DeAndre might try to drain my funds before filing his fake conservatorship. 2 hours later, Mr. Hayes called me back. His tone was grim and urgent. "Julius, your primary checking is untouched," he said. "But I checked the separate trust account holding Chorus life insurance payout. The entire $50,000 is gone. It was emptied out completely 2 months ago. The bank authorized the wire transfer because the withdrawal slip bore your exact signature." DeAndre had not just thrown away his mother's recipes, he had secretly forged my signature to steal her death benefit. The ultimate betrayal was already in motion. I hung up the phone with Mr. Hayes, but I did not call the police. I did not dial emergency services to report the forgery. Sending my son to jail for stealing $50,000 would be too easy, and it would not dismantle the rotten empire Audrey and her father had built. If I simply reported the fraud, DeAndre would go to prison while Audrey and her arrogant family walked away completely unscathed, playing the victims. I needed to see the entire board before I made my next move. I drove straight to the downtown office of Mr. Hayes. We sat in his glass-walled conference room going over the digital footprint of Maison de Lumière. Hayes was a bulldog in a tailored suit, and he knew exactly how to follow the money. I told him to pull every public record, every tax filing, and every vendor contract linked to that restaurant. If DeAndre had resorted to stealing his dead mother's life insurance just to stay afloat, the financial rot had to run much deeper than a simple budget overrun for imported Italian marble. We spent hours tracking shell companies and limited liability corporations trying to trace the web of Audrey's family real estate business. Hayes cross-referenced the restaurant's operational licenses with local bank registries and property tax records. We were looking for the main artery of their funding, and what we found made my blood run cold. As Hayes combed through the mountain of financial documents, my mind drifted to how DeAndre had transformed over the years. He used to be a boy who loved our loud, joyful neighborhood barbecues and the vibrant culture we came from. He used to stand beside Cora in the kitchen, eager to learn how to perfectly season a cast-iron skillet. But the moment he entered that Ivy League business school, he began systematically erasing his roots. He changed the way he spoke, the way he dressed, and distanced himself from anyone who looked like us. When he met Audrey, the erasure escalated into total submission. Audrey came from a world of generational wealth and country clubs, a world that viewed people like Cora and me as the help. DeAndre stopped inviting us to his dinners. He once asked me to park my old truck 2 blocks away when I visited his upscale apartment so her affluent friends would not see it. He sanitized his entire existence to become palatable to Audrey's family. He threw away the rich history his mother gave him and replaced it with a hollow imitation of high society. He wanted so desperately to sit at their table that he let them strip away his identity. He became a ghost wearing a designer suit, desperate for the approval of people who secretly despised him. He discarded chorus recipes because they reminded him of the truth he was trying so hard to hide. He thought that by burying his past, he could buy his way into their future. Mr. Hayes suddenly stopped typing and let out a sharp, heavy breath. He turned his laptop screen toward me and pointed at a series of hidden transactions buried deep within a subsidiary account. The truth we uncovered was absolutely horrifying. Maison de Lumière was not funded by legitimate bank loans or by Audrey's wealthy father. The initial capital came from a notorious shadow lending syndicate operating out of the city's industrial district. They were ruthless loan sharks who charged exorbitant illegal interest rates. But the most sickening part was the ownership structure itself. Audrey's family had completely insulated themselves from any financial or legal risk. Audrey's name was nowhere on the loan documents. Her father's real estate firm was entirely separated from the restaurant operations. They had legally structured the entire business so that DeAndre was the sole legal guarantor. He was the sole proprietor on paper. They were using my son as a legal meat shield. If the restaurant failed or the loan sharks came to collect, DeAndre would bear 100% of the liability. Audrey's father knew the restaurant was a massive financial trap. Instead of risking his own wealth, he manipulated DeAndre into taking on millions of dollars in dangerous illegal debt. Audrey played the supportive wife while quietly ensuring her hands were clean. They set him up to take the fall from the very beginning. The $50,000 he stole from Chorus Life Insurance was likely a desperate, panicked payment just to keep those violent loan sharks at bay for one more month. He was drowning in illegal debt, and his prestigious new family was perfectly content to watch him sink. They had pushed him to the edge of a cliff and convinced him he could fly. I left Mr. Hayes' office with a heavy heart and a cold, clear mission. I drove back to my neighborhood, the evening sun casting long shadows across the streets. As I turned onto my block, I noticed a sleek black SUV parked illegally across the street from my driveway. It had heavily tinted windows and no license plates. Two large men in cheap leather jackets were leaning against the hood, smoking cigarettes and staring directly at my front door. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, recognizing immediately that they did not belong in this quiet neighborhood. They did not look like neighborhood watch or lost tourists. They were enforcers. My phone buzzed with an urgent text message from Mr. Hayes. He had just uncovered one final, terrifying document. DeAndre did not just sign his own life away to the loan sharks. He had secretly listed my home address as his primary physical residence on the illegal loan guarantees. The violent monsters my son owed money to were no longer just looking for him. They were now sitting right outside my front door waiting to collect a debt I did not owe. I did not go back to my house that night. I knew those two enforcers leaning against the black SUV were waiting for me to pull into the driveway so they could intimidate me into paying a debt I did not owe. Instead, I drove right past my street and spent the night at a cheap motel on the other side of town. I barely slept. My mind was calculating every single variable in this dangerous game. As soon as the sun rose and the city began to wake up, I drove straight to the main downtown branch of my bank. I walked through the heavy glass doors the moment they unlocked for business. I bypassed the standard teller line and walked directly into the office of the branch manager, a woman named Sarah, who had handled my finances for over 2 decades. She greeted me warmly, but her smile faded when she saw the cold determination on my face. I sat down and gave her a direct, uncompromising order. I wanted every single account tied to my name completely frozen and locked down immediately. I told her to revoke all secondary access, revoke all authorized user privileges, and cancel every supplementary credit and debit card issued under my accounts. I knew DeAndre still had a backup credit card tied to my primary checking account from his college days. It was a card I had kept active just in case he ever faced a real emergency. He had clearly tried to use it again after completely draining his mother's life insurance trust. The manager typed rapidly on her keyboard, verifying my identification and confirming that the total blocks were in place. She asked no questions, sensing the gravity of the situation. No funds could move in or out without my physical presence and a strict dual authentication process. The financial umbilical cord that had fed his arrogant vanity for over a decade was officially and permanently severed. As the manager was printing the final confirmation receipts, the heavy glass doors of the bank lobby swung open with violent force. DeAndre stormed inside, causing several customers to step back in alarm. He looked completely unhinged. The custom velvet jacket from the grand opening was gone, replaced by a wrinkled designer shirt that looked like it had been slept in. His eyes were bloodshot, darting frantically around the polished room. He marched straight toward the teller line, waving a piece of plastic in the air. He was shouting at the bank staff, demanding to know why his transaction at a high-end jewelry store had just been declined. He was yelling about needing to buy an extravagant anniversary gift for Audrey to appease her wealthy father and keep up the facade of their success. When a uniformed security guard stepped forward to calm him down, DeAndre aggressively shoved the man aside. Then his frantic scanning eyes locked onto me sitting calmly inside the branch manager's glass office. The realization hit him like a freight train. He knew exactly why the plastic in his hand was suddenly worthless. He charged across the polished marble floor of the lobby, closing the distance between us in seconds. He threw open the glass door to the office, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were completely white. "What did you do?" he screamed, his voice cracking with a toxic mixture of panic and uncontrollable rage. "You have no right to touch my cards. I need that money right now to fix this." I stood up slowly, buttoning my suit jacket, taking my time. I did not flinch as he invaded my personal space. DeAndre was taller than me, younger, and physically stronger, but in that moment, he looked like nothing more than a terrified child throwing a violent temper tantrum. He raised his fist, pulling his arm back as if he was actually going to strike his own father right there in the middle of a crowded bank lobby. The security guards rushed forward, reaching for their radios to call the police, but I raised my hand, signaling them to stop. I wanted to see exactly how far my son was willing to go for a few dollars. I stood perfectly still, letting his shadow fall over me. I looked him dead in the eye, not breaking contact for a single second. "Are you really going to hit me, DeAndre?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, icy register that cut straight through his manic screaming. "Are you going to strike your own father because I finally cut off your milk supply?" The words struck him harder than any physical blow ever could. The absolute unwavering authority in my voice rooted him to the spot. His raised fist trembled in the air, but he could not bring himself to bring it down. "You stole $50,000 of your dead mother's life insurance." I continued my words, quiet but lethal, making sure only he could hear the full extent of his sins. "You forged my signature to steal from a ghost. You used my home address to secure a desperate loan from violent street thugs, putting my life in danger. You built a fake empire on stolen ground and borrowed time. And now that you cannot bleed me dry anymore, you want to throw a punch." I stepped an inch closer, closing the gap between us. "Do it," I challenged him. "Hit me. Let everyone in this room see the pathetic, desperate coward you have truly become." DeAndre's arm slowly dropped to his side. The aggressive fire in his eyes was instantly extinguished by a tidal wave of realization and profound shame. He realized I knew absolutely everything. He realized he had no more leverage, no more lies to hide behind, and absolutely no more of my money to save him from the wolves he had invited into his life. The heavy silence in the lobby was deafening as everyone watched the standoff. He backed away from me, his breathing shallow and erratic, his shoulders slumped. He was completely crushed by the undeniable weight of his own monumental failures. I gathered my printed documents, placed them securely into my leather briefcase, and walked right past him without uttering another word. I did not look back as I crossed the bank lobby, leaving him standing there in his own ruin, and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the bright morning sunlight. But just as I stepped onto the busy sidewalk, I saw a massive black SUV pull up to the curb with a screech of tires. It was the exact same vehicle with the heavily tinted windows that had been parked outside my house the night before. A heavily tattooed man with a thick neck and cold, dead eyes stepped out of the passenger side, leaving the engine running. He ignored my presence entirely and walked straight through the bank doors. I paused on the sidewalk and watched through the glass. The tattooed man approached my son. He did not yell or cause a public scene. He simply walked up behind DeAndre and placed a massive, heavy hand firmly on his shoulder. DeAndre jumped violently and turned around, his face draining of all remaining color until he looked like a corpse. The enforcer leaned in close and whispered something directly into his ear. DeAndre's knees literally buckled beneath him, sending him crashing down onto the polished marble floor. The countdown had officially started. The loan sharks were no longer waiting patiently for their money. The death sentence for his fake empire had just been activated. I drove away from the bank, leaving DeAndre on the floor. By the time I reached my temporary motel room, my phone began buzzing relentlessly. It was not DeAndre or the loan sharks. It was a barrage of notifications from a social media platform I rarely used. I opened the app and found my face plastered across the screen. Audrey had gone live. She was sitting in the immaculate living room of her penthouse, clutching a crumpled tissue, her perfectly styled hair intentionally messy to simulate distress. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks as she stared directly into the camera. She played the role of the terrified, helpless daughter-in-law to absolute perfection. "It breaks my heart to make this public," she sobbed, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "But we are fearing for our safety. My father-in-law, Julius, has been suffering from rapid-onset Alzheimer and severe paranoid delusions. He is completely losing his mind. Today he violently attacked my husband at a bank in front of dozens of witnesses. He has been hoarding money, screaming at strangers, and locking himself away in his house. We have tried so hard to get him the medical help he desperately needs, but he has become dangerously aggressive. We just want the loving grandfather back, but the man he has become is a threat to himself and to our family. Please pray for us. The video already had tens of thousands of views. She was spinning a brilliant, venomous narrative. By framing my strategic financial lockdown as a violent dementia-induced breakdown, she was building the exact public case she needed to steal my autonomy and my home. Below her video, the comment section was a horrifying parade of fake sympathy and misdirected outrage. Her wealthy friends, the same affluent people who had sneered at my worn suit during the restaurant opening, were now offering their hollow prayers and unsolicited legal advice. "Stay strong," Audrey, one woman wrote. "Dementia is so cruel, you have to protect yourselves and secure his assets before he ruins his own life and bankrupts your family." Another commented, "We had to put my uncle in a secure facility when he got aggressive. Get a court order immediately for your own safety. It was absolutely sickening." These country club socialites and trust fund heirs fed on drama, pretending to care, while casually endorsing the imprisonment of an old man they had never even spoken to. The internet mob blindly swallowed Audrey's perfectly crafted tears. People who did not know me were calling me a danger, a tragic burden who needed to be locked away in a padded cell for my own good. DeAndre was being painted as the dutiful, heartbroken son, doing everything he could to save his sick father. I sat on the edge of the cheap motel bed watching the shares and likes multiply by the second. Audrey was not just seeking sympathy. She was systematically destroying my reputation. She knew that in their elite circles, public perception was everything. If she could convince society that I was a deranged, violent old man holding on to a piece of prime real estate out of sheer insanity, then stepping in to take control of my life would look like an act of mercy instead of a blatant criminal theft. She was laying the groundwork for a judge weaponizing the court of public opinion to justify the ultimate betrayal. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. She was ruthless. I knew then that staying in a motel was no longer an option. I had to face this head-on. I packed my small bag and drove back to my house, prepared to confront whatever trap she had set. I had barely unlocked my front door and stepped inside when heavy authoritarian knocks pounded against the wood. I did not even have time to take off my coat. I looked through the front window and saw 2 police cruisers parked in my driveway, their lights flashing silently in the midday sun. Standing on my porch alongside 2 uniformed police officers with their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts was a stern-looking woman holding a thick clipboard. The ambush was immediate. I opened the door, keeping my posture straight and my hands perfectly visible. "Mr. Julius," she asked, her voice clipped and highly professional. "I am Agent Collins with Adult Protective Services. These officers are here to ensure a safe assessment. We have received multiple urgent reports regarding your declining mental health and a recent violent altercation downtown. We are here to execute a mandatory psychiatric evaluation." She held up a formal document stamped by a county judge. It was an emergency medical warrant. Audrey's video was not just a social media stunt. It was the catalyst she used to weaponize the state against me. They had moved with terrifying speed, using DeAndre's bank incident as undeniable proof of my supposed violent instability. I stood in my doorway staring at the armed officers who looked entirely ready to physically restrain me if I raised my voice or showed a hint of the aggression Audrey had fabricated. If I showed anger, they would call it dementia. If I resisted, they would call it paranoia. Agent Collins stepped forward, her eyes scanning my modest living room, searching for any signs of the hoarding or chaos my daughter-in-law had described. "Mr. Julius, you must come with us to the county medical facility right now for a 72-hour holding period and a full psychological workup," she stated, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "If you refuse, the officers are authorized to detain you for your own safety and the safety of the public." They wanted to put me in a straitjacket. They wanted to strip away my rights and hand the keys of my kingdom directly to the monsters who were trying to bury me. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. "I am fully cooperative, Agent Collins," I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of the madness they expected. "I understand you are just doing your job. Let me just grab my phone to call my attorney and I will walk to your vehicle voluntarily." As I reached for my phone on the entryway table, the screen lit up with an incoming call from Mr. Hayes. I answered it immediately, putting the phone to my ear while Agent Collins and the officers watched my every move. "Julius, do not say a word, and listen to me carefully." Hayes ordered, his usually composed voice tight with unprecedented urgency. "I just pulled the court filings attached to your emergency evaluation warrant. Audrey did not just use a Facebook video to get this order. She bought a doctor." "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my facial expression entirely neutral. "She bribed a corrupt neurologist at the downtown clinic," Hayes explained, speaking rapidly. "They illegally inserted a completely fabricated medical history into your official state health records. The file claims you have been suffering from advanced degenerative brain disease for over 2 years. Julius, the judge, signed the warrant because the state medical system officially recognizes you as legally incompetent right now. If they get you inside that facility today, they will use that fake file to lock you in a permanent psychiatric ward by tomorrow morning. You will lose the deed, the house, and your freedom." The situation was hanging by a single thread. I kept my face entirely impassive as I ended the call, with Mr. Hayes sliding the phone into my pocket. The police officers tensed their hands, hovering near their duty belts, preparing for the violent outburst Audrey had so carefully fabricated for her social media audience. Instead, I smiled warmly and stepped back, opening my front door wide to the afternoon sun. "Please come inside, Agent Collins," I said, gesturing politely toward my impeccably clean living room. "It is quite hot out there today, and you all look like you could use a glass of iced tea." The officers exchanged highly confused glances. This was absolutely not the hostile, chaotic hoarding environment they had been thoroughly briefed on by my daughter-in-law. I walked to the kitchen, moving with a steady, deliberate grace that betrayed no hint of madness or physical decline. I poured 3 glasses of sweet tea using the heavy crystal pitchers Cora had bought for special occasions decades ago. I carried the tray back to the living room and set it gently on the oak coffee table. Agent Collins remained standing, her clipboard held tightly against her chest, her eyes darting suspiciously around the room. Everything was in perfect, meticulous order. There was no clutter, no signs of paranoia, no neglected bills piled high, and absolutely no erratic behavior. I sat down in my armchair, crossed my legs, and looked directly into her eyes with absolute clarity. "I understand my son and his wife have painted a rather colorful picture of my mental state." I began, my voice smooth and entirely lucid. "I also understand you have an emergency warrant based on a medical file that claims I suffer from advanced degenerative brain disease." I took a slow sip of my tea, setting the glass down quietly. "However, before you try to put me in the back of your police cruiser, I highly suggest you review the actual facts of this situation." I reached into the leather briefcase resting beside my chair and pulled out a thick, sealed folder. Mr. Hayes had anticipated their malicious legal maneuvers days ago. He knew that the moment I cut off the financial supply at the bank, DeAndre and Audrey would attempt to weaponize the medical system against me to seize control of my estate. I handed the heavy folder to Agent Collins. "Inside that envelope is a comprehensive independent psychiatric evaluation," I stated firmly. "It was conducted less than 48 hours ago by Dr. Eris Thorne, the chief of psychiatry at the State Medical Board. It includes a full cognitive scan, long-term memory retention tests, and an exhaustive psychological profiling battery. You will find that Dr. Thorne officially declared my cognitive function to be in the top percentile for my age group. I am completely competent, entirely lucid, and perfectly capable of managing my own financial affairs." Agent Collins carefully opened the folder and scanned the official stamped documents, her brow furrowing. The stern authoritarian look on her face began to crack, melting into profound confusion. "But the clinic downtown submitted sworn records showing severe aggressive dementia," she murmured, tracing the official seal on Dr. Thorne's report. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "The clinic downtown accepted a massive illicit cash bribe from my wealthy daughter-in-law to forge those specific records," I replied flatly. "My attorney has already filed a formal criminal complaint with the medical board and the state prosecutor's office regarding that corrupt doctor, but I do not expect you to just take my word for it." I picked up a small remote control from the side table and turned on the large flat television screen mounted on my living room wall. It was connected to the discreet security cameras I had installed inside my own home years ago to keep an eye on the property. I pressed play. The screen showed the crystal-clear, high-definition footage of DeAndre kicking my front door and storming into my kitchen the previous day. The audio recording was flawless. The officers watched in stunned silence as my son aggressively threw the property transfer deed onto the table. They heard him explicitly threaten to bribe a medical professional and lock me in a psychiatric ward if I refused to sign my house over to his wealthy father-in-law to pay off his debts. They watched him tower over me, his face twisted with violent rage, demanding that I surrender my entire estate to fund his failing French restaurant. The video proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my supposed dementia was nothing more than a calculated malicious extortion plot designed to strip me of my assets. The security video ended and the living room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The two police officers who had arrived ready to physically restrain a dangerous madman were now staring at the blank television screen with absolute disgust. Agent Collins slowly lowered her clipboard, her face pale with shock and outrage. She looked from the television to the pristine psychiatric evaluation in her hands and then finally back to me. I sat there perfectly composed, waiting for the dark reality of the situation to fully register in her mind. "I am so terribly sorry, Mr. Julius," she whispered, her professional facade completely shattered by the sheer cruelty of what she had just witnessed. "We were entirely misled. They used us to try and steal your home and strip you of your fundamental human rights." I nodded slowly, taking another sip of my sweet tea. "They did not just try to steal my home, Agent Collins. My son also forged my signature to drain his deceased mother's life insurance trust fund to pay off illegal loan sharks." I reached into my briefcase again and handed her the official bank statements Mr. Hayes had pulled, proving the fraudulent $50,000 wire transfer. Agent Collins' jaw tightened in anger. She turned to the police officers standing behind her and gave a sharp, definitive nod. The narrative had completely flipped in a matter of minutes. The powerful state apparatus that Audrey had arrogantly summoned to destroy me was now locking its sights directly onto her and my son. "This is no longer a wellness check," Agent Collins declared, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "Attempting to weaponize state medical warrants to extort real estate from a senior citizen is a severe criminal offense. Coupled with the forged bank wire and the threats on tape, this is textbook elder financial abuse. That is a federal felony carrying mandatory prison time. We are officially opening a criminal investigation into DeAndre and his wife immediately." The lead police officer pulled out his radio and contacted dispatch to cancel the medical transport unit. The hunters had officially become the hunted. As the police cruisers pulled out of my driveway, leaving me alone in my quiet sanctuary, my cell phone rang again. It was Mr. Hayes, and he was not calling to celebrate our victory over the fraudulent medical warrant. His breathing was heavy and his voice was completely devoid of its usual courtroom swagger. "Julius, we have a massive new problem," Hayes said, speaking rapidly over the line. "Our discreet inquiries into the commercial zoning records for Lot 405 triggered an automated corporate alert system. The executive legal team at Southern Heritage Foods just figured out that someone is holding the original 1928 deed and the recipe journal." "How did they find me?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "They have billions of dollars and unlimited surveillance resources," Hayes replied grimly. "They know you have the journal, Julius, and they know that little leather book can destroy their entire global spice empire overnight. I just got an urgent tip from an inside contact at their corporate headquarters. Their elite crisis management lawyers are currently in a black executive town car speeding toward your house right now. You need to brace yourself. The real war is walking up to your front door." I barely had time to process Mr. Hayes' warning before a sleek black executive town car glided smoothly to a stop right in front of my house. The heavy engine hummed with quiet power, a stark contrast to the loud, aggressive arrival of the police cruisers earlier that afternoon. 3 men stepped out of the vehicle, moving with synchronized predatory precision. They wore impeccably tailored charcoal gray suits, their shoes polished to a mirror shine reflecting the bright sunlight. They did not look around my working-class neighborhood with curiosity. They looked at my home with the cold, calculating gaze of men accustomed to buying whatever they wanted and crushing whatever they could not. I stood in the open doorway, waiting. The lead attorney, a man with slicked-back hair and a razor-sharp smile, walked up my porch steps without waiting for a proper invitation. He stepped right over the threshold, entering my living room as if his firm had already purchased the property. His 2 associates flanked him, standing silently like well-paid, high-end bodyguards. The lead attorney did not offer his hand for a shake. He did not introduce himself or ask how I was doing. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his bespoke jacket, pulled out a pristine rectangular slip of paper, and tossed it onto my oak coffee table. The heavy cardstock landed face up. It was a certified cashier's check issued directly by the corporate treasury of Southern Heritage Foods. I looked down at the bold printed numbers. $100,000. To a retired studio mechanic living on a fixed monthly pension, they assumed this was an astronomical sum. They assumed I would fall to my knees in immediate gratitude. The lead lawyer adjusted his silk tie, his eyes scanning my modest living room with poorly disguised disdain. "That is a highly generous gesture of corporate goodwill, Mr. Julius," he said, his voice slick and entirely hollow. "Consider it a fast, painless solution to a massive problem you absolutely do not want to have." I kept my hands resting firmly at my sides, staring at the corporate shark standing in the middle of my living room. "A solution to what problem exactly?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. The lawyer let out a short, patronizing laugh. "Let us skip the amateur theatrics," he said, taking a deliberate step closer to assert dominance. "Our executive board was alerted to a quiet zoning inquiry regarding commercial lot 405. We also have highly credible intelligence indicating you are currently in possession of an old family recipe journal. We understand the sentimental value of such vintage items, but from a strict legal standpoint, that journal represents a severe complication to our proprietary corporate assets." He pointed a manicured finger at the check resting on the table. "That money is yours today. All you have to do is hand over the original leather notebook and sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. The contract includes a perpetual copyright waiver relinquishing any and all historical claims your family might have against Southern Heritage Foods. It is a very clean, very profitable exit for you." I did not move a single muscle. "And if I refuse," I asked. The polite professional facade instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a cold, ruthless corporate cruelty. "If you refuse, we will completely bury you," he stated plainly. "We know exactly what is happening with your son DeAndre and his failing French restaurant. We know he is drowning in illegal debt to very dangerous people. If you do not sign that waiver today, Southern Heritage Foods will officially partner with Maison de Lumière. We will pour millions of dollars in corporate sponsorships into his business to bail him out. We will hire the most aggressive litigation firms in the country and put them entirely at your son's disposal. We will weaponize your own family against you. We will drag you through the appellate courts for the next 10 years, bleeding you dry with relentless legal fees until you lose this house, your pension, and your mind. We will ensure that the fraudulent medical conservatorship your daughter-in-law filed becomes a brutal reality. You will end up bankrupt and locked in a state-run nursing home while your son becomes a multimillionaire on our payroll." He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing into dark slits. "You are just a retired mechanic playing a high-stakes game you cannot possibly comprehend. Take the money and walk away before we destroy your life." I looked down at the piece of paper sitting on the table. $100,000. For decades, Southern Heritage Foods had generated billions of dollars in global revenue. They built sprawling corporate campuses across the country, sponsored massive sporting events, and paid their executives obscene annual bonuses. And every single cent of that massive empire was built entirely on the stolen genius of my wife's family. I thought of Cora's grandfather Ezekiel, who had likely been threatened, intimidated, or legally swindled out of his life's work by men wearing suits exactly like these. I thought of Cora standing in our cramped kitchen, her hands calloused and permanently burned by hot oil cooking day and night, just to scrape together a meager living for our family. Her sweat, her blood, and her brilliant culinary soul had been hijacked by a massive white corporate machine that actively erased her existence and packaged her rich heritage into cheap plastic bottles for mass consumption. Now these men had the absolute audacity to walk into my home and offer me a microscopic fraction of the wealth they had looted from my family, actively threatening to use my own corrupted son as the executioner if I dared to seek justice. The sheer arrogance of their extortion was staggering. I did not yell. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose my temper or show any fear. I slowly reached down and picked up the certified check. The lead lawyer smirked, assuming I had finally surrendered to the overwhelming pressure of their corporate threat. Instead, I gripped the edges of the heavy cardstock and ripped it straight down the middle. The sharp tearing sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. The lawyer's smug smirk vanished instantly. I placed the two halves together and tore them again. I kept tearing the thick paper until the $100,000 bribe was reduced to tiny, worthless shreds of confetti. I opened my hand and let the pieces flutter to the floor, landing directly on the tips of the lawyer's polished Italian shoes. "Now, you are going to leave my house," I said, my voice radiating an unyielding, lethal authority. "And you can tell your executive board that the price for my family legacy just went up to a number they cannot afford." The three corporate lawyers stood frozen in absolute shock, staring at the shredded check scattered across the floor. Without uttering another word, they turned and marched out of my house, their faces pale with furious disbelief. The moment their black town car sped away from my curb, I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed my attorney. Mr. Hayes picked up on the first ring. "They just left," I told him, my tone completely devoid of hesitation or doubt. "The corporate bribe was firmly rejected, and the battle lines are officially drawn. I want you to file the intellectual property and historical fraud lawsuit against Southern Heritage Foods immediately. Hit them with every single piece of ammunition we have, but that was only the beginning of the assault. Mr. Hayes." I continued, my grip tightening on the phone. "It is time to execute the final protocol. Take the 1928 land deed down to the city registry and activate my absolute ownership of commercial lot 405. Freeze every single operational license attached to that property. DeAndre and Audrey thought they could build their arrogant elite empire on my back while treating me like dirt. Now I am going to pull the ground right out from under them." The war was no longer just a bitter family dispute. It was a full-scale demolition. I knew that dropping the legal hammer on the restaurant would take at least 48 hours to process through the city courts. During that brief window, DeAndre was completely exposed to the violent street thugs he owed money to. If I let the loan sharks tear him apart immediately, I would never uncover the full extent of Audrey's family conspiracy. I needed them to feel safe. I needed them to believe they had won so they would expose their ultimate endgame. I picked up my phone and dialed my son's number. When he answered, I did not use the firm, commanding voice that had terrified him in the bank lobby. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I let a harsh, raspy cough interrupt my words. "DeAndre." I wheezed, making my voice tremble with manufactured defeat. "The police came by today. The social workers. They told me everything. I am so tired, son. I cannot fight this anymore. I do not want to be locked away in a hospital. Please just come to the house. Bring Audrey. I will sign the preliminary transfer papers so you can sell this place and pay off those terrible people. I just want to be left in peace." He agreed immediately, his tone barely concealing his sudden wave of eager relief. Less than an hour later, their luxury sedan pulled into my driveway. I made sure the living room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tight to create an atmosphere of suffocating gloom. I sat slumped in my old armchair, a thick wool blanket draped over my knees, trembling my hands deliberately as I waited for them to walk through the door. When DeAndre and Audrey walked into the living room, the shift in their demeanor was absolutely sickening to witness. Gone was the panicked, desperate man who had collapsed on the bank floor. Gone was the terrified woman who had sobbed on a social media live stream. They walked into my home with the swagger of conquerors surveying a newly captured territory. Audrey did not even bother to greet me. She immediately crossed her arms, letting out a sharp, derisive smirk as she looked down at my frail, slumped posture. She pulled out her expensive smartphone, her thumbs flying across the screen with rapid precision. I knew exactly who she was messaging. She was texting her wealthy father, letting the real estate tycoon know that the stubborn old mechanic had finally broken and the property was theirs for the taking. She did not even try to hide her absolute contempt. DeAndre, however, decided to put on a theatrical performance that would have won him an acting award. He rushed over to my chair, dropping to his knees and grabbing my intentionally trembling hands. He squeezed them tightly, forcing a series of loud, dramatic sobs from his chest. "Dad, I am so sorry it had to come to this," he cried, producing actual crocodile tears that streamed down his face. "I swear I will make this right. I knew you would not abandon me. We are going to take such good care of you once the house is sold. We will find you a nice, quiet, assisted living facility where you can rest without any stress. You are doing the right thing, Dad. You are saving my life." I stared into his watery eyes, listening to the hollow, empty promises spilling from his mouth. He was looking directly at his father and lying with the practiced ease of a seasoned con artist. He felt absolutely no remorse for attempting to steal my home or for forging my signature. He was simply overjoyed that his horrific manipulation tactics had apparently worked. He thought he had successfully bullied a sick, vulnerable old man into surrendering his only sanctuary. It took every ounce of willpower I possessed to keep my face completely blank to suppress the overwhelming wave of absolute disgust rising in my throat. I nodded slowly, letting out another ragged fake cough. "I just want the threats to stop, DeAndre," I whispered, playing the role of the defeated victim to absolute perfection. "I will give you the house. Just protect me from those violent men you owe money to." Audrey stepped forward, retrieving a sleek leather folder from her designer handbag. She pulled out a stack of documents and placed them on the coffee table right in front of me. "These are the preliminary intent to sell agreements and the temporary power of attorney waivers," she said, her voice brisk and entirely devoid of any warmth. "My father's legal team drafted them this afternoon. Once you sign these, it gives us the legal authority to immediately leverage the equity of this house to clear DeAndre's commercial debts. We will bring the final deed transfer tomorrow with a public notary, but this will get the creditors off our backs tonight." I looked down at the documents. They were standard predatory contracts designed to strip a property owner of all their rights before the actual sale even took place. I slowly reached for the pen Audrey held out to me. My hand shook violently, a deliberate tremor to sell the illusion of my declining motor skills. Inside, my mind was calculating with cold mechanical precision. I knew these preliminary papers were entirely legally worthless because Mr. Hayes had already filed the irrefutable primary injunctions blocking any transfer of my assets. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name at the bottom of the pages using a sloppy, hesitant signature that barely matched my real handwriting. I signed every single page they put in front of me, sealing their false sense of absolute victory. DeAndre eagerly snatched the documents off the table the moment my pen lifted from the final line. "Thank you, Dad." He breathed a massive grin of relief breaking through his fake tears. "You just saved our entire future. We will handle everything from here. You do not have to worry about a single thing anymore." Audrey snatched the signed papers from DeAndre and shoved them triumphantly back into her handbag, snapping the gold clasp shut with a sharp, definitive click. "We need to go deliver these to my father immediately," she commanded, turning on her heel and marching toward the front door without another glance in my direction. DeAndre gave my shoulder a quick, patronizing pat before eagerly following his wife out of the house. I stayed seated in my armchair, watching them walk out to their luxury car, feeling the immense weight of their arrogance fill the room. They drove away completely convinced they had just executed the perfect crime. They believed they had stripped me of my home, my legacy, and my future, but they were completely oblivious to the fatal mistake they had just made. While DeAndre had been sobbing on his knees and Audrey was busy texting her father, I had deliberately dropped my pen near the leg of the coffee table. When I reached down to retrieve it, I had quickly and silently pressed a micro-listening device, a highly sensitive military-grade audio bug provided by Mr. Hayes, private investigator, directly onto the bottom of Audrey's expensive handbag. The trap was permanently set. I stood up from my chair, my fake tremor vanishing instantly. Now I was going to hear exactly what they planned to do with the man they thought they had just destroyed. I did not waste a single second after their luxury sedan pulled out of my driveway. I walked directly to my home office and booted up the highly encrypted audio receiver Mr. Hayes had provided. I dialed the attorney and patched him into the secure frequency so he could listen simultaneously from his downtown firm. I put on a pair of heavy noise-canceling headphones, locking out the rest of the world. The military-grade bug attached to the bottom of Audrey's designer handbag transmitted crystal-clear audio directly into my ears. I could hear the rhythmic hum of their car engine and the faint sound of classical jazz playing on their stereo system. DeAndre let out a loud, arrogant laugh that echoed violently inside the enclosed vehicle. "Did you see him shaking Audrey?" He gloated, his voice completely devoid of the sorrow he had just faked in my living room. The old man folded faster than a cheap suit. "I told you I could break him. He is terrified of going to a mental ward." I sat in my quiet office staring at the blank wall as my son's cruel laughter filled my ears. He was celebrating my supposed downfall. He truly thought he had completely outsmarted me, using my own paternal love and fear as a weapon against me. Mr. Hayes remained silent on the other end of the line, letting the undeniable proof of DeAndre's absolute moral bankruptcy wash over us. The audio feed picked up the sound of Audrey dialing her cell phone through the car's Bluetooth system. The ringing stopped, and a deep, gravelly voice answered the call. It was Audrey's father, the wealthy real estate tycoon who despised my son. I turned the volume up to the maximum, making sure I captured every single syllable of the conversation that was about to unfold. The car pulled to a smooth stop. DeAndre announced he was running into a high-end liquor store to buy their most expensive bottle of vintage champagne to celebrate their ultimate victory over me. The moment the heavy car door slammed shut, Audrey dropped her supportive wife act entirely. Her voice instantly shifted from the sweet partner to a cold, calculating corporate operative. The idiot actually got his father to sign the waivers, she told her father with a sharp, derisive sneer. We have the preliminary deeds in hand, her father's gravelly voice boomed through the speakers, radiating ruthless authority. Excellent work, Audrey, he replied. Have your lawyers finalize the liquidation of the old man's residential property immediately. We need that cash to satisfy the shadow lenders before those violent thugs come knocking on my door. But Audrey was not finished. And what about DeAndre? She asked, her tone utterly devoid of any human affection. I cannot stand playing the loving wife to this pathetic loser for another minute. He is a massive liability, and he is entirely out of his depth. Her father let out a dry, heartless chuckle that made my skin crawl. Do not worry, my dear. We stick exactly to the original exit strategy. Tomorrow morning we will bury the final debt transfer clauses deep inside the notary documents for the restaurant. We will make sure DeAndre assumes 100% of the remaining personal liability for the commercial failure. The second the money from his father's house clears the loan sharks, we pull all our remaining capital out of the business. You will file for an expedited divorce citing his financial negligence and erratic behavior. We will strip his name from the restaurant ownership and throw him right back into the gutter where he belongs. He will be left with absolutely nothing, not even a single dollar from his own father's estate. I sat paralyzed in my chair listening to them systematically plan the absolute destruction of my son. They had never respected him. They had never viewed him as an equal family member or a legitimate business partner. To them, DeAndre was nothing more than a convenient, disposable pawn. They were going to drain my life savings to clean up their own illegal financial mess, and then they were going to discard my son like garbage, leaving him to face bankruptcy and total ruin entirely alone. The car door opened and closed. DeAndre had returned completely oblivious to the brutal execution order his wife and father-in-law had just signed against him. He sounded breathless and giddy, rattling a heavy glass bottle. I got the best vintage champagne they had, he announced, completely blind to the trap closing around his throat. Audrey smoothly shifted back into her role as the devoted, loving wife, praising his success with sickening ease. Her father remained on the speakerphone, his tone shifting to a facade of warm, patriarchal approval. You did well today, DeAndre, her father lied smoothly. But we still need a massive injection of corporate capital to rebrand the restaurant once this mess is cleared. DeAndre's response made my stomach churn with profound, inescapable revulsion. Do not worry, sir, DeAndre said, his voice dripping with pathetic eagerness to please the man who was actively plotting his demise. I received an incredible offer from the corporate attorneys at Southern Heritage Foods. They want to completely buy out the rights to my mother's original recipe journal. They want to own her name and her legacy permanently. I am going to sign the entire intellectual property over to them tomorrow morning. It will bring in millions in corporate sponsorships for our restaurant group. He was bragging about it. My son was enthusiastically offering to sell the very soul of his deceased mother to a massive corporate conglomerate just to buy a few more scraps of fake approval from a man who actively despised him. He was willing to erase Cora's name from history, to monetize her decades of burned hands and exhausted nights, purely to fund a vanity project that he would not even own by the end of the week. He was enthusiastically throwing away his bloodline to please his executioners. The sheer tragedy of his self-hatred was staggering to witness. He had severed his own roots to climb a tree that was already rotting from the inside out. He thought he was buying a seat at their table, but he was only paying for his own funeral. I reached out and pressed the power button on the audio receiver, plunging my home office into absolute heavy silence. Mr. Hayes remained on the open phone line, waiting patiently for my response. Julius, he asked quietly, did you hear all of that? I heard enough, I replied, my voice devoid of any warmth, any hesitation, and any remaining trace of paternal leniency. My son had made his choice. He had willingly climbed onto the sacrificial altar of high society and handed them the knife. I had spent my entire life trying to protect him, trying to elevate him, but he had chosen to worship the very people who were plotting to bleed him dry. Any lingering drop of mercy I harbored in my heart for the boy I raised completely evaporated. The father who had sold his prized vintage car to buy his son a suit was officially dead. "Mr. Hayes," I said, standing up from my desk and looking out the window into the gathering dark. "The time for playing games is over. Trigger the eviction notice. Unleash the copyright injunctions. Bankrupt them all. The final purge was beginning, and I was going to burn their fake kingdom to the ground." The very next morning, the legal machinery Mr. Hayes and I had meticulously prepared slammed into DeAndre and Audrey's fake empire with the force of a runaway freight train. Before the sun even fully crested over the city skyline, Mr. Hayes stood before a superior court judge. He presented the authenticated 1928 land deed alongside a mountain of irrefutable forensic evidence detailing the fraudulent zoning manipulation executed by Audrey's billionaire father. The judge, a strict constitutionalist with zero tolerance for historical real estate theft, took one look at the documents and immediately granted our primary injunction. By 10 in the morning, a team of armed court marshals arrived at the pristine, imported Italian glass doors of Maison de Lumière. The restaurant staff was busy preparing for the exclusive lunch rush, polishing crystal glasses and arranging expensive floral centerpieces. They were entirely unprepared for the reality check walking up their steps. The marshals ordered the bewildered general manager to evacuate the premises immediately. They slapped a massive neon orange legal notice directly onto the center of the heavy glass doors. It was a formal judicial freeze order. It explicitly stated that all commercial operations were indefinitely suspended due to a severe property ownership dispute. The elite patrons who began arriving for their expensive reservations were turned away at the sidewalk by uniformed officers. The high society illusion DeAndre had sacrificed his soul to build was completely shattered in broad daylight for the entire city to witness. The shockwaves of that neon orange sign rippled through the affluent circles of the city with devastating speed, reaching the penthouse office of Audrey's father in a matter of minutes. The so-called untouchable real estate tycoon experienced a level of fury and panic he had never known in his privileged life. For decades, he had bullied, bribed, and maneuvered his way into controlling prime commercial real estate. He assumed the original black owners of Lot 405 had been erased by gentrification and time. Discovering that a retired studio mechanic not only held the original perpetual deed, but had successfully weaponized the federal courts to freeze his multi-million-dollar investment sent him into an absolute rage. He realized instantly that his shell companies had poured millions of dollars into constructing a luxury building on land he had absolutely zero legal claim to. His entire corporate portfolio was suddenly flagged for historical property fraud. He was totally trapped. Simultaneously, the corporate headquarters of Southern Heritage Foods descended into absolute, unprecedented chaos. Mr. Hayes had officially filed our intellectual property lawsuit early that morning. The legal filing included verified high-resolution scans of Chorus' original recipe journal and Mr. Klein's sworn authentication of the chemical breakdowns that matched their billion-dollar spice blends exactly. The massive corporate conglomerate realized instantly that they were staring down the barrel of a catastrophic public relations nightmare. If the national media discovered that their entire global empire was built on the stolen culinary genius of a black family from the 1920s, their stock prices would absolutely plummet. Their elite crisis management team scrambled into emergency board meetings. They desperately tried to put out the fire before it consumed them. The smug corporate lawyers who had stood in my living room the day before, treating me like an ignorant peasant, were now sweating through their bespoke suits. They contacted Mr. Hayes immediately, begging for a swift resolution. The shredded $100,000 check was no longer on the table. Within an hour, they wired a formal, legally binding settlement offer directly to my attorney's office. They were offering me a staggering $5 million in clean, untraceable cash. $5 million to drop the land claim, hand over the physical leather journal, and sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement locking my family history away in their corporate vault forever. Mr. Hayes called me into his office to present the $5 million offer. He laid the heavily drafted settlement contract on his desk, looking at me with a mixture of professional awe and deep respect. $5 million is enough to buy a private island, Julius, he said quietly. It is enough money to live 10 lifetimes without ever looking at a price tag again. They are absolutely terrified of you. I sat in the leather chair across from him, looking at the numbers printed on the crisp white paper. To a man who had spent his life repairing projectors and counting pennies for groceries, $5 million was an incomprehensible sum. It was the kind of money that made people compromise their morals and abandon their principles. But they fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. They thought my pride had a price tag. I thought about Cora. I thought about her standing over that boiling deep fryer, her hands permanently scarred, working 14-hour days to pay for the education of a son who would eventually throw her legacy into a trash can. No amount of corporate cash could ever buy back her pain, her sacrifice, or her erased history. I pushed the settlement contract back across the desk, sliding it directly toward Mr. Hayes. "Reject the offer entirely," I said, my voice completely devoid of hesitation or doubt. "I do not want a single cent of their dirty corporate hush money." Mr. Hayes leaned back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "And what exactly is our counteroffer?" he asked, leaning forward to take notes. I looked him dead in the eye, delivering my unyielding terms. "I demand a full front-page public apology printed in the Sunday editions of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post," I stated coldly. "They must explicitly admit to the historical theft of the recipes. They must acknowledge Cora's grandfather Ezekiel by name. They must publicly confess that their entire corporate empire was built on stolen heritage. Furthermore, they must relinquish all trademark rights to the specific spice blends derived from my wife's journal. Until they meet every single one of those demands, the lawsuit moves forward to the discovery phase where all of their dirty corporate secrets will become permanent public record. Tell them my family legacy is no longer for sale." Mr. Hayes nodded vigorously, his pen flying across his legal pad. The corporate executives thought they could bury me with a mountain of cash. They were about to learn that absolute integrity is the most dangerous weapon in the world. I returned to my quiet neighborhood feeling the first true wave of profound justice settling deep into my bones. The board was perfectly set and my enemies were scrambling in the dark. I walked into my kitchen, poured myself a tall glass of iced tea, and sat by the window watching the afternoon sun stretch across my lawn. The absolute silence of my home was a stark contrast to the destruction I was actively causing downtown. Suddenly, my cell phone shattered, the quiet vibrating aggressively on the wooden table. I looked at the screen. It was DeAndre. I took a slow sip of my tea before answering, pressing the phone to my ear without saying a word. "Dad, please, you have to help me," DeAndre screamed into the receiver. His voice was pure, unfiltered terror. He was not calling to brag about vintage champagne or fake corporate contracts anymore. He was hyperventilating, gasping for air as if he was physically drowning. He was crying real, desperate tears. The city health department just stormed the restaurant. He sobbed, his voice cracking hysterically. They brought armed police escorts with them. They are tearing apart the kitchens and locking all the doors. I do not know what is happening. They are pulling meat from the freezers and threatening to arrest me for severe code violations. Dad, please, you have the house, you have the equity. Please do something before they take me away in handcuffs. The walls were finally closing in, and my son had absolutely nowhere left to run. I listened to my son hyperventilating through the phone, his voice cracking under the weight of his collapsing reality. I did not feign ignorance. I knew exactly why the armed health inspectors were tearing through his pristine stainless steel kitchen. Earlier that morning, Mr. Hayes had utilized a highly placed anonymous contact within the city's Department of Public Health. He directed them exactly where to look. DeAndre babbled incoherently, trying to explain the absolute disaster unfolding around him. Audrey had been slashing their operational budget for weeks, trying desperately to funnel cash to her father's failing holding companies. To offset the massive losses, she had explicitly ordered their Michelin-trained chef to bypass premium local vendors and purchase heavily discounted expired meat. She forced the kitchen staff to mask the rancid taste of rotting poultry under thick layers of heavy truffle sauces and imported reductions. The inspectors found pounds of spoiled chicken sitting in broken freezers and recorded dozens of critical temperature violations. I listened quietly as DeAndre explained the fatal blow. The lead inspector had not just issued a simple citation. They completely revoked the restaurant's health permit and slapped a mandatory 7-day suspension on the entire operation. It was a categorical death sentence. The city's highly lucrative annual restaurant week was scheduled to begin in exactly 48 hours. Maison de Lumière had booked hundreds of non-refundable reservations for elite clients expecting a flawless culinary experience. Missing that week meant instant absolute bankruptcy and permanent public disgrace. Less than 20 minutes after he hung up the phone, my front door rattled as DeAndre fumbled with his emergency key. He practically fell into my living room, his designer shirt completely soaked in sweat, his expensive leather shoes scuffed and dirty. He did not look like the arrogant restaurateur who had publicly thrown his mother's recipe journal into a garbage can. He looked like a cornered, terrified animal. He stumbled forward and literally collapsed onto my living room rug, dropping to his knees right at my feet. "Dad, you have to save me," he wailed, grabbing the fabric of my trousers with shaking hands. The fines are astronomical. The health department is demanding $50,000 in immediate penalty fees just to consider a rapid re-inspection before the weekend. Audrey is not answering her phone. Her father has completely blocked my number. I am the sole guarantor on all the vendor contracts. If we do not open for restaurant week, I am entirely ruined. He looked up at me with tears streaming down his face, his chest heaving with desperate sobs. "I know I have been a terrible son," he pleaded, his voice thick with panic. "I know I treated you badly, but I am begging you. You still have this house, you have your pension. You can take out a reverse mortgage today. Just give me the $50,000 to pay the city fines and get the doors open. I will pay you back every single cent with interest. I promise, Dad, I will do whatever you want." I looked down at the man kneeling on my floor. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no parental urge to comfort him, and certainly no desire to reach for my checkbook. He was not crying because he regretted disrespecting his mother or threatening to lock me in a psychiatric ward. He was crying because his wealthy in-laws had abandoned him to take the legal fall for their financial crimes, and his fake kingdom was burning to the ground. "You want me to drain my life savings to pay the penalty for serving rotten meat to your wealthy friends?" I asked, my voice echoing with icy detachment. "You stood by while your wife intentionally poisoned your customers to save a few dollars, and now you want my money to buy your way out of the consequences." DeAndre scrambled to find an excuse, wiping his face with his trembling hands. It was Audrey's idea, he stammered desperately, trying to shift the blame. "She managed the supply chain. I did not know the meat was expired until the inspectors pulled it out of the walk-in cooler. But they are holding me legally responsible. Our signature dish is the only thing keeping the investors from pulling their capital entirely. If I can just get the kitchen open and serve our famous heritage poulet frit, we can survive this week." I stared at him as he mentioned his famous $100 signature dish. It was a dish that had won him rave reviews in local food magazines, a dish praised for its complex, soulful flavor profile. I slowly reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp legal document heavily stamped with the seal of the federal court. I did not hand it to him. I dropped it directly onto the rug in front of his knees. "I highly doubt you will be serving that particular dish ever again," I said, my tone perfectly flat. DeAndre stared at the paper, his tear-filled eyes scanning the bold legal print. It was a formal judicial cease and desist order immediately effective. The injunction explicitly banned Maison de Lumière and DeAndre personally from producing, marketing, or selling the heritage poulet frit. He looked up at me, his face entirely devoid of comprehension. "What is this?" he whispered. "This is the end of your culinary career," I replied, stepping back from his grasp. "That $100 dish you have been bragging about is a direct, unauthorized theft. You stole the exact spice blend and preparation method from your mother's personal recipe journal. The same peasant food you threw in the trash. That recipe is currently the subject of a massive federal intellectual property lawsuit. You are legally forbidden from cooking, selling, or profiting from Chorus legacy ever again. If you fry a single piece of chicken using her formula, you will be arrested for violating a federal court order." DeAndre sat frozen on the floor, staring at the court order as the absolute totality of his ruin finally crushed him. He had no health permit, no signature dish, no wealthy wife, no financial backing, and absolutely no way out. He was completely stripped of everything he had sacrificed his soul to build. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg for one final scrap of mercy, but the words died in his throat. A sudden deafening crash against my front porch shattered the heavy silence in the room. Heavy, aggressive footsteps stomped across the wooden planks outside. Dark, menacing shadows fell across the frosted glass of my front window, blocking out the afternoon sun. Someone began pounding on my heavy oak door with such violent force that the entire doorframe rattled on its hinges. It was not the police. It was not the health inspectors. Audrey's father, realizing that his legal maneuvers had entirely failed against me, had bypassed the courts and resorted to the criminal underworld. He had sent his hired thugs directly to my home. I stood perfectly still in the doorway, not blinking, not stepping back. I did not show a single ounce of the fear they were so accustomed to seeing. The violent pounding against my heavy oak door had shaken the framed photographs on the hallway walls just moments before. DeAndre had scrambled backward across the living room rug, his expensive leather shoes scraping frantically against the floorboards as he tried to put as much distance between himself and the front entrance as possible. He had curled his knees to his chest, his face drained of all color, letting out a pathetic whimper. He knew exactly who was on the other side of that wood. Audrey's wealthy father had realized that his expensive corporate lawyers and judicial maneuvers were entirely useless against me. So the billionaire real estate tycoon had completely abandoned his high society facade and resorted to the dirty tactics of the criminal underworld. He had sent his hired muscle to my doorstep to terrorize an old man into surrendering a multi-million-dollar property. I did not panic. I did not rush to the telephone to dial emergency services. I calmly adjusted the cuffs of my suit jacket, stepped over my cowering son, and walked directly to the front door. I unlocked the deadbolt and swung the heavy door open wide, inviting the afternoon sunlight and the threat into my home. 3 massive men stood on my porch. They were not wearing the tailored suits of corporate attorneys. They wore heavy dark jackets and thick steel-toed boots. The man in the center, a towering figure with a thick neck and a jagged scar cutting across his jawline, was casually tapping a solid aluminum baseball bat against his open palm. The metallic clink echoed sharply in the quiet neighborhood. The other 2 men flanked him, crossing their massive arms, staring down at me with cold, predatory eyes designed to inflict absolute terror. "You have been causing a lot of expensive problems for a very powerful man, old-timer." The lead thug growled, his voice a deep, menacing rumble. "We are here to help you understand that holding onto a piece of paper that does not belong to you is very bad for your health. You are going to sign the deed withdrawal right now, or we are going to start breaking things inside this house, starting with your bones." I reached slowly inside my breast pocket. The 2 men flanking the leader tensed, dropping their hands toward their waistbands, anticipating a weapon. But I did not pull out a firearm. I pulled out a sleek silver flash drive and a crisp, folded piece of paper heavily stamped with federal insignias. I held the paper out, offering it to the man with the baseball bat. "I highly suggest you read that before you decide to swing that piece of aluminum," I said, my voice radiating a dark, unyielding calm. The lead thug frowned, clearly confused by my complete lack of intimidation. He stopped tapping the bat, snatched the paper from my hand, and scanned the bold printed text. His eyes widened slightly as his brutal mind processed the legal terminology. "That document is a verified receipt from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network." I explained, speaking slowly and deliberately as if I were instructing a child. "My attorney, Mr. Hayes, spent the last 48 hours doing a deep forensic audit of your wealthy boss. We bypassed his domestic shell companies and looked directly into his offshore holdings. We found the Cayman Island accounts. We found the massive wire frauds. We found over a decade of blatant federal tax evasion and illegal racketeering money funneled through his commercial real estate developments." I took a step forward, crossing the threshold onto the porch, forcing the massive thug to actually take a half step backward. I pointed directly at the silver flash drive in my hand. "Everything is on this drive." I continued, my tone dropping to a lethal whisper. "Account numbers, wire transfer logs, and the exact names of the dummy corporations your boss uses to launder money. A complete copy of this drive has already been handed over to a senior contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Right now, it is sitting in a sealed vault. It acts as my personal insurance policy. If a single window in my house is broken, if a single scratch appears on my vehicle, or if anyone in my family suddenly meets with an unfortunate accident, that drive goes straight to a federal grand jury. The man who pays your salary is a sinking ship. He is currently under active federal investigation, and he does not even know it yet. If you touch me today, the FBI will be kicking down his door and yours by tomorrow morning." The thug stared at the federal receipt in his hand and then looked back up at me. He was a violent man, but he was not stupid. He knew the difference between a simple intimidation job and walking blindly into a massive federal racketeering indictment. He understood that his billionaire boss had sent them into a trap. He slowly lowered the baseball bat, holding it loosely at his side. He crumpled the federal receipt, shoved it into his jacket pocket, and turned to his associates, giving them a sharp jerk of his head. "We are done here," he muttered aggressively to his men. Without another word, the 3 hired thugs turned their backs, walked down my porch steps, and climbed into an unmarked black SUV parked idling at the curb. They sped away, leaving nothing but a faint cloud of exhaust fumes dissipating in the autumn air. I stood on the porch, watching the vehicle disappear around the corner. I felt a profound shift deep within my own soul. For 69 years, I had lived my life as a quiet background character. I was a studio mechanic. I spent my days in the dark projection booths fixing broken gears, replacing burnt-out bulbs, and ensuring the big picture ran smoothly for the wealthy executives sitting in the velvet seats. I was trained to be invisible, to keep my head down, to work hard, and to never disrupt the system. I had allowed people like Audrey's father and even my own son to view me as a disposable peasant because I had always accepted my place at the bottom of the hierarchy. But standing on that porch, breathing in the crisp air, I realized I was no longer a mechanic fixing someone else's machine. I had become the absolute architect of the entire system. I turned around and walked back into my living room, closing the heavy oak door behind me with a solid, satisfying click. DeAndre was still sitting on the floor, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. He had just watched his elderly father effortlessly dismantle a squad of violent street enforcers using nothing but a piece of paper and sheer psychological dominance. He looked at me as if he were seeing a complete stranger, and in a way he was. The lenient, forgiving father who had sold his vintage car to buy his arrogant son a tailored suit was completely dead and buried. I was now the master of the chessboard, and I controlled every single piece on the table. I did not offer DeAndre a hand to help him off the floor. I did not offer him a glass of water or a word of comfort. I simply walked past him, my footsteps heavy and deliberate, heading toward my kitchen to finish my iced tea. He was a pawn who had played himself into a corner, and I was going to let him sit in his own ruin. The absolute finality of my control was cemented the very next morning. DeAndre had spent the night curled up on my living room sofa, too terrified to return to his apartment or his restaurant. Just as the sun began to rise, a bonded legal courier arrived at my front door holding a thick certified envelope addressed directly to DeAndre. I signed for it and tossed the heavy package onto his chest, waking him from a restless sleep. He tore open the cardboard seal, his hands shaking violently as he read the formal legal notice inside. It was an official declaration from the new registered owner of commercial lot 405, me. The brief grace period was officially over. The letter stated in cold, uncompromising legal terms that the monthly lease for the land beneath Maison de Lumière had just been tripled. Furthermore, due to the severe breach of contract regarding the suspended health permits and illegal vendor debts, the new rent was due in full within exactly 24 hours. If the astronomical sum was not wired into my holding account by tomorrow morning, the physical locks on the building would be changed, all restaurant assets would be permanently seized, and the eviction would be absolute. DeAndre dropped the paper, his jaw trembling. He was entirely trapped. The 24-hour deadline I gave DeAndre was an impossible hurdle designed to break his spirit completely. But I underestimated the sheer reckless desperation of his wife. Instead of accepting defeat, Audrey decided to double down on her delusions. She convinced DeAndre that they could cheat the system one last time. Through Mr. Hayes and his vast network of city informants, I learned exactly what she had orchestrated. Despite the heavy neon orange suspension notices slapped across the front doors of Maison de Lumière, Audrey had quietly reached out to her father's elite network of private equity investors and venture capitalists. She organized an exclusive underground fundraising gala right inside the legally sealed building. It was an incredibly dangerous and highly illegal maneuver. They instructed the wealthy guests to enter through the discreet rear loading docks, winding through the dark alleyways to bypass the health department seals entirely. Audrey intended to dazzle these billionaires with expensive champagne and empty promises, hoping to secure a massive influx of emergency capital before the night was over. If she could just get one major investor to write a substantial check, she believed they could pay off the violent shadow lenders, cover my astronomical rent increase, and buy enough time to tie me up in endless litigation. DeAndre, completely shattered and terrified for his life, went along with the suicidal plan. He was so addicted to the illusion of his success that he was willing to risk federal arrest just to keep the lights on for one more night. He truly believed that if he could just put on the tuxedo and smile for the cameras, the nightmare would somehow disappear. The interior of the restaurant was staged to absolute perfection, carefully designed to hide the fact that the business was actively rotting from the inside. They kept the ambient lighting incredibly low, casting deep, warm shadows to conceal the empty display freezers and the dismantled kitchen equipment. The room was filled with wealthy socialites and ruthless hedge fund managers sipping smuggled vintage wine, completely unaware that they were standing in a legally condemned property. Audrey glided across the floor in a stunning silver silk gown, playing the flawless hostess. She smiled and laughed, spinning a brilliant lie that this was a private VIP soft relaunch for their most valued financial partners. Then the ambient music faded into silence, and DeAndre stepped up to a small elevated stage at the center of the dining room. He wore a crisp white tuxedo jacket, his hair immaculately styled, but beneath the bright spotlight I could see the heavy sheen of nervous sweat coating his forehead. He gripped the microphone stand with white knuckles and launched into his highly rehearsed pitch. He looked out at the sea of wealthy investors and began spinning a fabricated fairy tale about his journey. He spoke passionately about building a self-made empire from the ground up. He talked about grit, determination, and his visionary culinary genius, completely ignoring the fact that his signature dishes were stolen directly from his deceased mother. I built this place on the foundation of hard work and family values. He proclaimed, his voice echoing through the sound system. We are not just serving food, we are serving a legacy of excellence. It was the absolute peak of his hypocrisy, a breathtaking display of arrogant delusion. He painted himself as a brilliant independent entrepreneur fighting against the odds, deliberately erasing the illegal loans, the forged signatures, and the stolen land beneath his feet. The crowd clapped politely, raising their crystal glasses to toast a man who was nothing more than a hollow fraud. While DeAndre was busy selling his soul to the highest bidder, I was preparing for my entrance. I did not wear the old charcoal church suit from the opening night. That man, the quiet, accommodating father who accepted scraps from the table and tolerated endless disrespect, was gone forever. Earlier that afternoon, Mr. Hayes had taken me to his personal tailor in the financial district. I was now dressed in a flawless midnight blue bespoke suit crafted from the finest imported Italian wool. It fit me with absolute precision, serving as tailored armor designed for corporate warfare. I wore a crisp white shirt, a conservative silver silk tie, and polished leather Oxfords that gleamed like dark glass under the streetlights. For 40 years I had worn grease-stained coveralls and heavy work boots. Now I looked like a Fortune 500 board member, a true tycoon who commanded respect the moment he entered a room. I arrived at the front of the restaurant accompanied by Mr. Hayes and 2 armed private security contractors. The private guards Audrey had hired to watch the front entrance stepped forward to block my path, crossing their arms aggressively. Mr. Hayes simply smiled and flashed the official property deed alongside a copy of the federal injunction. This building is the private property of Mr. Julius, he stated firmly, and you are actively facilitating a criminal trespass. The guards immediately stepped aside, recognizing that they were standing on the wrong side of the law. I reached out and grabbed the polished brass handles of the heavy main double doors. I pushed them open with a violent, forceful thrust. The heavy doors slammed against the interior walls with a sound like a thunderclap, instantly cutting off the polite applause and silencing DeAndre's speech. Every single head in the room turned toward the entrance. The elite investors stared in absolute shock at the imposing figure stepping out of the shadows and into the ambient light. Audrey stood near the bar, her crystal glass slipping from her fingers and shattering against the marble floor. Her jaw dropped in sheer terror. She did not see the helpless peasant she had mocked just weeks ago. She saw the absolute master of the estate radiating a cold, terrifying power. I did not stop at the edge of the room to survey the crowd. I did not acknowledge the gasps of the wealthy guests or the panicked whispering rippling through the dark restaurant. I locked my eyes directly on DeAndre and began marching straight up the center aisle. My polished leather shoes clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor, echoing like the ticking of a countdown clock. The sea of billionaires and high society elites instinctively parted for me, stepping back and lowering their gaze as I radiated an aura of lethal, unyielding authority. DeAndre stood absolutely frozen on the stage, looking like a deer caught in the headlights of a massive speeding truck. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His mouth opened and closed mechanically, trying to form a word, trying to say something, to stop the inevitable, but no sound came out of his paralyzed throat. He was completely trapped by the reality crashing down upon him. I walked up the 2 small steps onto the elevated stage, invading his space entirely. I looked him dead in his terrified eyes, seeing the absolute collapse of his fake empire reflected in his trembling pupils. Without saying a single word, I reached out and snatched the microphone right out of his shaking hand. I tapped the microphone with a single firm strike to ensure the sound system was fully active. The sharp electronic feedback echoed through the cavernous dining room, instantly cutting through the lingering whispers of the wealthy crowd. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice steady, deep, and resonating with absolute, unyielding authority. "For those of you who do not know me, my name is Julius. I am the father of the man currently standing paralyzed beside me. But far more importantly, for the sake of your collective financial portfolios, I am the sole indisputable legal owner of Commercial Lot 405. Yes, that is the exact parcel of land upon which this entire lavish establishment is currently built." A collective gasp rippled through the sea of venture capitalists and hedge fund managers. I held up my hand to silence their rising murmurs, maintaining absolute command of the room. My son just stood on this stage and spun a highly emotional, incredibly compelling fairy tale about his visionary journey. He sold you an inspiring story about a self-made empire built on grit and a deep respect for familial legacy. It was a beautifully rehearsed speech. It was also a complete and utter fabrication from beginning to end. I paced the edge of the elevated stage, making direct eye contact with the most powerful investors in the city. This restaurant is not an independent triumph. The ground beneath your expensive designer shoes belongs entirely to my family, secured by a permanent, irrevocable land deed issued in 1928, a historical deed that was intentionally and maliciously ignored by the corrupt real estate developers who originally funded this arrogant vanity project. DeAndre remained entirely frozen, his face completely devoid of color, staring at me with hollow, empty eyes as I publicly dismantled the very foundation of his fake existence. I reached inside the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavily stapled legal document bearing the glaring red seal of the city court. I did not hand it to my son. I raised it high in the air for the entire room to see and then slammed it down onto the wooden podium with a resounding, violent crack that made DeAndre physically flinch. "This," I declared, projecting my voice to the farthest corners of the shadowy restaurant, "is a formal and immediate eviction notice. It was officially served by the federal court because the proprietors of Maison de Lumière have comprehensively violated absolutely every single clause of their commercial lease agreement." The elite investors leaned forward, their crystal champagne glasses lowering as the gravity of my words set in. "Let me be absolutely clear about the toxic asset you are being asked to invest your clean capital into. Tonight," I continued, unleashing the full, devastating arsenal of the truth. "You are not buying equity in a rising culinary star. You are blindly throwing your money into a massive, heavily leveraged sinkhole. This restaurant is completely and entirely bankrupt. It is currently drowning in millions of dollars of illicit debt owed directly to violent shadow lenders operating deep within the criminal underground." I pointed a steady accusatory finger directly at DeAndre, who hung his head in absolute crushing shame. "Furthermore, the highly praised signature dishes you were hoping to aggressively monetize are the product of blatant intellectual property theft. The recipes were stolen directly from his deceased mother. A massive federal copyright injunction has already been officially filed and granted, making it a federal crime for this establishment to serve, market, or profit from those menu items ever again." I paused for a fraction of a second, letting the severity of the federal legal threat sink deep into the calculating minds of the venture capitalists. And if federal copyright fraud and illegal loan sharking are not enough to deter your investments, perhaps you should know why the front doors of this building are currently plastered with heavy neon orange suspension notices. Just 48 hours ago, the Department of Public Health completely revoked their operating licenses. To cut operational costs, the management team actively ordered their kitchen staff to serve severely expired, rotting meat, heavily masked by expensive sauces, to their elite clientele. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and violently chaotic. The carefully constructed high society illusion shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before my eyes. Hedge fund managers who had been perfectly ready to write massive six-figure checks just moments ago were now hastily shoving their luxury pens back into their tailored jackets. I watched as several prominent investors physically tore their preliminary investment agreements into shreds, letting the paper fall to the marble floor in absolute disgust. The The sheer horror of being legally and publicly associated with a bankrupt health code violating criminally indebted enterprise sent a wave of sheer panic through the elite crowd. Several wealthy socialites, repulsed by the sudden horrifying revelation that they might have been fed rotting poultry, slammed their glasses onto the tables and immediately marched toward the rear exits. The grand, sophisticated fundraising gala had instantly transformed into a desperate, chaotic stampede of wealthy elites trying to escape a sinking ship. Standing near the dark mahogany bar, Audrey's father finally snapped. The billionaire real estate tycoon, realizing that his ultimate financial exit strategy was imploding in real time, completely lost his polished aristocratic composure. His face turned a dangerous shade of crimson, his veins bulging against his stiff collar. "Turn off that microphone," he roared, his voice echoing furiously over the rising din of the panicking investors. He stormed forward, pushing through the retreating crowd, and pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at me. "This man is a lunatic. He is trespassing on private commercial property. Guards, get in here right now and throw this insane old man out onto the street." He was utterly desperate, thrashing wildly to salvage his failing scheme by silencing the only person in the room telling the brutal truth. Two large private security guards, clearly on his direct corporate payroll, began pushing their way forcefully through the dispersing crowd, reaching aggressively into their dark jackets as they locked their menacing sights on the stage. I did not retreat a single inch. I did not flinch or break eye contact as the heavy-set guards closed the distance, their massive hands reaching out to physically drag me off the wooden podium. I simply stood my ground, my posture radiating absolute, unyielding dominance. Because I knew something the screaming billionaire tycoon did not. I knew that his hired security guards would never reach the stage. Before the muscle could even place a single hand on my bespoke suit, a blinding barrage of red and blue emergency lights suddenly flooded through the high frosted glass windows of the restaurant. The wailing, deafening sound of multiple police sirens cut fiercely through the crisp night air, coming to a screeching, aggressive halt right outside the sealed front entrance. Mr. Hayes had made a very specific, highly urgent phone call exactly 10 minutes before we walked into the building. The heavy locked double doors were violently kicked open, not by private security, but by a heavily armed tactical squad of city police officers. They were responding to a highly prioritized, confirmed report of an illegal commercial gathering taking place inside a federally condemned and medically quarantined property. The real authorities had arrived, and there was absolutely no escape for the liars trapped inside. The uniformed police officers flooded the dining room, their heavy boots crunching against the scattered shards of crystal that littered the marble floor. They fanned out rapidly, securing the exits and demanding that everyone step away from the doors. The remaining venture capitalists and socialites pressed themselves against the walls, desperate to avoid any implication in a police raid. Audrey's father froze, his arrogant commands dying in his throat as a police captain stepped directly into his path. Realizing that brute force and corporate intimidation had completely failed against the sudden presence of law enforcement, Audrey immediately pivoted to the only weapon she had left. She weaponized her tears. She threw herself forward, pushing past the bewildered investors, and ran directly toward the lead police officer. She collapsed against his arms, sobbing hysterically, her silver silk gown shimmering under the flashing red and blue lights reflecting through the windows. "Officer, please, you have to arrest that man," she wailed, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at me. "He is my father-in-law, and he is completely insane. He suffers from severe advanced dementia and violent paranoid delusions. We have been trying to get him committed to a psychiatric facility for weeks. He broke in here tonight to destroy our private charity event. He is a profound danger to himself and to everyone in this room." She wept with absolute theatrical perfection, burying her face in her hands, playing the role of the terrified, helpless victim to the hilt. She begged the officers to drag me away in handcuffs, pleading with them to lock me in a hospital before I hurt someone. The police officers exchanged uncertain glances, momentarily disoriented by her flawless performance of aristocratic distress. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I did not waste a single breath arguing with a woman whose entire existence was a carefully constructed lie. Let her scream, let her cry, let her spin her web of deceit in front of the police. I simply stepped off the elevated stage and walked with calm, deliberate purpose toward the audio control booth, situated near the edge of the dining room. The sound engineer had abandoned his post when the police breached the doors, leaving the massive commercial mixing board completely unattended. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and pulled out my smartphone. With the methodical precision of a master mechanic, I located the primary auxiliary input jack and plugged my device directly into the restaurant's state-of-the-art surround sound system. Audrey was still weeping hysterically, clinging to the police captain's arm, demanding my immediate incarceration. I unlocked my screen, opened the encrypted audio file Mr. Hayes had sent me, and cranked the master volume slider on the mixing board to its absolute maximum limit. I pressed play. A sudden sharp burst of static crackled through the ceiling speakers, followed instantly by the crystal-clear recording of the conversation captured inside their luxury sedan just days prior. Audrey's own voice, cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of her current manufactured tears, boomed through the cavernous dining room with deafening clarity. "The idiot actually got his father to sign the waivers," the recorded. Audrey sneered, her vicious words echoing off the imported Italian marble walls. "We have the preliminary deeds in hand." The entire room went dead silent. The police officers stopped moving. The investors froze. Then the deep, gravelly voice of her billionaire father rumbled through the speakers, confirming their malicious conspiracy. "Excellent work, Audrey," the recording played. "Have your lawyers finalize the liquidation of the old man's residential property immediately. We need that cash to satisfy the shadow lenders." Then came the absolute killing blow. I watched my son as Audrey's recorded voice asked her father what to do about DeAndre. "I cannot stand playing the loving wife to this pathetic loser for another minute," the speakers blasted. "He is a massive liability." Her father's recorded laughter filled the room, followed by his brutal execution order. "Tomorrow morning, we will bury the final debt transfer clauses deep inside the notary documents. The second the money from his father's house clears the loan sharks, we pull all our remaining capital out. You will file for an expedited divorce. We will strip his name from the restaurant ownership and throw him right back into the gutter where he belongs." I stood by the soundboard and watched the absolute destruction of a man. DeAndre turned to stone. The color entirely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He stood on the stage, completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the ceiling speakers as the undeniable truth of his pathetic existence rained down upon him. He slowly turned his head, looking at the wealthy white wife he had sacrificed his own mother to please. Audrey had stopped crying entirely. She was frozen, her hands hovering in the air, staring at the sound system in pure, unadulterated horror. Her flawless mask had been violently ripped away, exposing the ruthless, calculating monster underneath. DeAndre then looked at his billionaire father-in-law, the powerful man he had worshipped, the man whose approval he had sought so desperately that he was willing to sell his own bloodline. He finally understood. He was never a partner. He was never family. He was nothing more than an expendable debt mule, a convenient idiot bred for the slaughter. The brutal reality crushed whatever was left of his soul. The billionaire real estate tycoon was completely humiliated. His illegal schemes and treacherous family betrayals were now broadcasting live to the city police and his wealthiest investors. The sheer embarrassment and legal jeopardy caused him to snap entirely. He lunged forward across the marble floor, his face contorted in absolute fury. "You stupid, careless child," he roared at his own daughter. He raised his heavy hand and slapped Audrey with a sickeningly loud crack that echoed across the silent room. The sheer force of the blow sent her stumbling backward, her designer heels giving way. She crashed hard onto the floor, her silver gown tangling around her legs. DeAndre did not move to help her. He simply stood there, a hollow shell of a man, watching his fake kingdom eat itself alive. Total chaos erupted. The police officers immediately lunged forward, restraining the screaming billionaire and pulling him away from his daughter on the floor. The remaining elite investors, seeing the imminent criminal arrests and wanting absolutely nothing to do with the fallout, scrambled frantically toward the police-secured exits. They shielded their faces from the flashing red and blue lights outside, practically trampling each other in their desperate haste to abandon the toxic property. Within minutes, the grand dining room was completely emptied of its high society patrons, leaving behind a wasteland of overturned chairs, shattered crystal, and spilled vintage wine. DeAndre remained anchored to the stage, staring vacantly into the shadows, completely unresponsive to the shouting officers and his wailing wife. I stood perfectly still by the audio booth, watching the final ashes of their empire drift to the ground. The absolute silence that followed the evacuation was sudden and suffocating, but that silence did not last. Before the police captain could even read the billionaire his rights, a deafening explosive crash obliterated the peace. The heavy locked glass doors at the main entrance were violently shattered inward, showering the marble lobby with thousands of razor-sharp fragments. The real monsters had finally arrived. 6 massive figures stepped through the jagged remains of the shattered glass doors, their heavy boots grinding the broken shards into a fine powder. They did not wear masks or attempt to hide their identities. They wielded heavy steel pipes, thick wooden bats, and wore the cold, dead expressions of men who collected blood when cash was unavailable. The few remaining police officers who had just escorted the screaming billionaire out the side exit to avoid the gathering press were completely cut off and outmanned. The Shadowlenders poured into the lobby with sheer, overwhelming force, ignoring the badges and focusing entirely on their target. Seeing the violent street syndicate invading her pristine restaurant, Audrey did not scream for her husband. She did not reach out to grab DeAndre's hand or try to pull him to safety. Her survival instinct kicked in with absolute ruthless clarity, exposing the complete lack of love in her dark heart. She kicked off her silver designer heels, abandoning them on the polished marble floor, and sprinted barefoot toward the rear kitchen exits. The remaining members of her wealthy entourage followed her like terrified rats fleeing a sinking ship, shoving each other violently out of the way to escape into the dark alleyways. Within seconds, the entire high society facade evaporated, leaving only the grim, brutal reality of the criminal underworld. DeAndre was left entirely alone. He stood on the stage, trembling violently, completely abandoned by the woman he had sold his soul to marry and the billionaire family he had desperately tried to impress. The lead enforcer, the same massive, heavily scarred man who had previously stood on my front porch, stepped over the glittering shards of broken glass. He slapped his steel pipe against his open palm, the rhythmic metallic sound echoing ominously in the deserted dining room. He locked his dead predatory eyes entirely on my son. DeAndre backed away, stumbling clumsily off the elevated stage and crashing into a table of spilled champagne. He scrambled backward across the floor, his custom white tuxedo jacket now stained with red wine and dirt. He hit the heavy oak paneling of the back wall with a dull thud. There was nowhere left to run. The enforcers fanned out, forming a tight, inescapable semicircle around him. They did not rush. They moved with the terrifying patience of predators who already had their prey completely cornered. DeAndre looked wildly around the room, his eyes wide with absolute sheer terror. He saw me standing calmly near the audio control booth, entirely untouched and unbothered by the invading thugs. The men who had come to collect their illicit debt knew exactly who I was, and they knew I held the federal leverage that kept them from touching me. They ignored my presence entirely, focusing all their violent intent on the man who actually owed them millions. DeAndre, realizing I was his absolute last hope on earth, scrambled across the ruined marble floor on his hands and knees. He crawled through shattered crystal and spilled food, shredding the knees of his expensive trousers. He reached me and threw his arms around my legs, burying his tear-soaked face into the fabric of my bespoke suit. "Dad, please," he wailed, his voice a high-pitched, hysterical shriek. "You have to save me. They are going to kill me, Dad. They are going to break my legs and kill me right here. You own this building now. You have the property. You have the money. You can pay them. Please, just write them a check. Tell them you will cover the debt. You are my father. You cannot let them do this to me." He squeezed my legs so tightly his knuckles turned white, sobbing uncontrollably, begging for the very life he had so arrogantly squandered just days before. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping, broken man clutching my shoes. I felt absolutely no parental urge to shield him. The biological connection between us had been permanently severed by his own treacherous actions. I slowly reached down and firmly grabbed his wrists. I did not do it with gentle paternal care. I dug my fingers into his flesh, prying his desperate grip off my legs with cold mechanical force. I shoved his hands away, pushing him back down onto the cold, hard marble floor. I crouched down so my face was perfectly level with his tear-streaked eyes. I looked into his terrified soul and delivered the final, absolute judgment. "I do have money, DeAndre." I stated, my voice smooth, quiet, and entirely devoid of mercy. "I have the deed to this land. I have the millions in equity. I have the power to write a check that would make these men turn around and walk out that door instantly. I watched a brief, pathetic flicker of hope ignite in his bloodshot eyes before I permanently extinguished it. But I do not serve people like you anymore. I continued my words, slicing through the air like a scalpel. I only cater to special people now. DeAndre stared at me, his jaw trembling as my words registered. I leaned in a fraction of an inch closer, ensuring he heard every single syllable of his own damnation. This establishment does not serve peasant food, remember? I reminded him of the exact cruel words he had used when he threw his mother's recipes into the garbage can. You chose these people. You chose this massive debt. You chose this fake life. Now you get to pay the bill. I stood up, straightening my tailored suit jacket, and calmly adjusted my cuffs. I did not give him another second of my time. I turned my back on my only son and began walking methodically toward the shattered front entrance. I did not look over my shoulder when the lead enforcer stepped forward and grabbed DeAndre by the collar of his ruined tuxedo, lifting him forcefully off the marble floor. I did not flinch when the first sickening crunch of the steel pipe connecting with bone echoed through the dining room. DeAndre's agonizing guttural screams filled the cavernous space, echoing off the expensive imported Italian walls he had sacrificed his own mother to buy. "Dad," he shrieked, his voice tearing through the night. "Please come back." But my footsteps never slowed. I walked straight through the broken glass doors and stepped out into the cool, refreshing night air, leaving the burning ruins of his fake kingdom entirely behind me. The heavy darkness swallowed his screams, and I finally breathed in the absolute silence of total victory. Exactly 1 month passed since the night the glass doors of Maison de Lumière shattered into a million pieces. The absolute destruction I promised had swept through the city like a cleansing wildfire, leaving nothing but scorched earth in its wake. The silver flash drive I handed over to the federal authorities was not an empty threat. It contained decades of meticulously cataloged corporate rot. Federal agents wearing tactical gear raided Audrey's father's real estate holding company before the sun even rose the following Monday. They seized corporate servers, froze offshore accounts, and slapped the billionaire with a staggering 72-count federal indictment for racketeering, money laundering, and massive tax evasion. His entire untouchable corporate empire evaporated overnight. All of his assets were instantly frozen, leaving his spoiled family with absolutely nothing. Audrey, the woman who had sneered at my worn suit and aggressively mocked my deceased wife's cooking, found herself entirely cut off from the generational wealth she had weaponized her entire life. Her father was sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting trial without the possibility of bail. Her luxury penthouse was seized by the federal bank examiners. I saw her just last week. She was not wearing a silver silk gown or walking in designer heels. She was wearing a hideous mustard yellow polyester uniform, carrying a plastic tray of dirty dishes at a greasy roadside diner on the outskirts of the industrial district. Her perfectly manicured nails were chipped and permanently stained with cheap industrial dish soap. She was wiping down sticky laminated tables and serving cheap black coffee to exhausted truck drivers for minimum wage plus tips. I parked my car across the street just to watch her for a few minutes. The poetic justice was absolute and uncompromising. The elite socialite who proudly declared her establishment did not associate with peasant food was now relying entirely on the spare change of actual working-class people just to keep a cheap roof over her head. The illusion of her superiority was completely dead. The criminal underworld had exacted its brutal physical toll on my son, but the federal justice system was entirely responsible for finishing the job. I sat in the back row of the federal courthouse, the heavy polished oak benches, a stark contrast to the sterile clinical atmosphere of the room. The heavy double wooden doors swung open and DeAndre was wheeled into the courtroom by an armed court bailiff. He was completely unrecognizable from the man who had worn custom velvet jackets. The arrogant restaurateur who had swaggered through VYP galas was entirely gone. He sat slumped in a standard-issue steel hospital wheelchair, dressed in an oversized drab orange prison jumpsuit. Both of his legs were encased in thick, heavy plaster casts pinned together by a terrifying cage of external metal fixators, holding his shattered bones in place. The Shadowlenders had made good on their violent promise, crushing his femurs and permanently crippling his physical mobility before tossing him into a dark alleyway like garbage. But the agonizing physical pain was nothing compared to the legal reckoning he was about to face. He was not on trial for his failed restaurant or his illegal shadow loans. The state prosecutors were charging him with felony wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Mr. Hayes had handed the authorities the irrefutable bank logs proving DeAndre had forged my signature to completely drain his dead mother's $50,000 life insurance trust. The federal judge, a stern, uncompromising woman with zero tolerance for elder financial abuse, looked down at my son from her elevated mahogany bench with absolute, unfiltered disgust. She read the charges aloud, detailing exactly how he had maliciously exploited a sacred family trust to artificially fund a fraudulent luxury lifestyle. DeAndre did not have the money to hire a high-powered defense attorney to spin his lies. He was represented by an exhausted, overworked public defender who could do nothing but advise him to plead guilty and throw himself on the mercy of the court. But there was absolutely no mercy left in that massive room. The judge slammed her heavy wooden gavel down onto the sounding block with a resounding, violent crack that made DeAndre physically flinch in his metal wheelchair. She sentenced him to a mandatory minimum of 5 years in a federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. As the bailiff turned his wheelchair to wheel him away to the holding cells, DeAndre twisted his neck in a painful arc to look back at the public gallery. He found me sitting in the very back row, my posture perfectly straight, my expression completely unreadable. He opened his mouth to speak, to beg for a final ounce of forgiveness, but I simply blinked and turned my head away, erasing him from my line of sight entirely. After the final sentencing concluded, I did not go back to my quiet neighborhood to celebrate or to mourn the loss of my bloodline. I walked 2 blocks down the bustling downtown street to the towering glass building where Mr. Hayes managed his elite law firm. We sat in his quiet, sunlit office overlooking the sprawling city skyline below us. Spread out across the center of his polished mahogany desk was a thick stack of final legally binding documents. This was the ultimate absolute severance. These papers were not just financial safeguards designed to protect my assets. They were absolute categorical declarations of legal disownment. I picked up the heavy brass fountain pen Mr. Hayes offered me. My hand did not shake even a fraction of a millimeter. The deliberate theatrical tremor I had used to trick DeAndre and Audrey into exposing their vile conspiracy in my living room was entirely gone. My grip was firm, strong, and incredibly steady. I signed my name across the bottom of the last will and testament, officially and permanently stripping DeAndre of any future claim to my estate, my state pension, or the massive commercial equity I now fully controlled. I legally severed the biological tie, cutting the rotting toxic branch away from my family tree to ensure the roots survived. I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow, grief, or regret as I watched the black ink dry rapidly on the crisp white paper. I felt a profound, icy serenity settling deep into the center of my chest. For 34 years, I had carried the suffocating weight of my son's endless expectations and his toxic, blinding ambitions. I had compromised my own comfort and continuously betrayed the memory of my wife's hard labor trying to mold him into a respectable, honorable man. Signing those comprehensive documents was not a petty act of vengeance. It was an act of profound, necessary liberation. I was finally reclaiming my own identity. I handed the brass pen back to Mr. Hayes, who meticulously stamped and notarized the final pages, sealing the disownment into the permanent federal record. The experienced mechanic had successfully excised the broken gear and the machine was finally running perfectly. I left the law firm, walking out into the bright afternoon sun, and hailed a passing taxi. I directed the driver to take me straight to the heart of the arts district. I stepped out onto the busy sidewalk and looked up at the massive structure occupying commercial lot 405. The pristine, arrogant facade of Maison de Lumière was swarming with industrial demolition crews wearing bright yellow safety vests. A massive, heavy-duty construction crane idled in the middle of the blocked-off street, its thick steel cable hooked directly to the center of the pretentious French neon sign mounted above the entrance. With a loud, grinding mechanical roar, the crane pulled backward violently, ripping the glowing letters completely off the building. The heavy sign crashed down into an industrial metal dumpster below, shattering into 1,000 useless, unrecognizable pieces. Right beside the dumpster, a large flatbed truck was carefully unloading a brand-new custom-made wooden sign. It was currently covered by a thick canvas tarp, completely obscuring the painted letters underneath. Workers shouted instructions to each other, preparing the heavy-duty rigging equipment to hoist the new legacy high into the air. The old toxic kingdom was officially dead and buried, and the new, highly anticipated era was literally being hoisted into the sky. The legal battle with Southern Heritage Foods culminated not in a quiet backdoor settlement, but in a highly publicized, unprecedented corporate surrender. The following Sunday morning, I walked down to the local newsstand and purchased a physical copy of the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. I returned home, sat at my quiet kitchen table with a cup of hot black coffee, and opened the papers to the center fold. There, printed in bold, undeniable black ink, was a full-page public apology issued directly by the executive board of the billion-dollar conglomerate. They explicitly acknowledged Ezekiel by name, crediting him as the original culinary architect of their entire global spice empire. They formally confessed to the historical theft of his intellectual property and permanently relinquished their trademark claims to the specific flavor profiles detailed in my late wife's journal. But the apology was only the beginning of their legally mandated penance. Bound by the uncompromising terms, Mr. Hayes had aggressively negotiated the corporate conglomerate legally established the Cora Heritage Foundation. It was a staggering $10 million permanent endowment fully funded by their corporate treasury and completely managed by an independent board of directors. The massive fund was explicitly designed to provide full-ride culinary and business scholarships exclusively to underprivileged black students across the entire country. Cora's legacy was no longer locked away in a dusty, grease-stained notebook or buried underneath the predatory greed of a massive white corporate machine. Her name was now etched into history, permanently opening doors for thousands of young, ambitious minds who actually respected where they came from. 3 months later, commercial lot 405 was completely unrecognizable. The pretentious imported Italian marble and the cold, intimidating glass exterior of Maison de Lumière had been entirely gutted and replaced. In its place stood a warm, inviting brick facade with large, welcoming windows that radiated the comforting glow of amber lighting. The heavy canvas tarp covering the new sign was finally pulled back, revealing the beautifully hand-painted lettering that proudly displayed the name Cora Souls. We were not serving microscopic portions of seared duck or overpriced truffle risotto to elite hedge fund managers. We were serving the exact recipes DeAndre had so viciously mocked and thrown into a garbage can. We were serving perfectly seasoned fried chicken, simmering pots of rich collard greens, slow-cooked oxtails, and warm, sweet potato pie made entirely from scratch using the exact chemical breakdowns Mr. Klein had authenticated. Word of the restaurant and the incredible story of historical justice behind it had spread like wildfire through the city. On the day of the grand opening, the line of eager customers stretched completely around the block, winding down the sidewalk and spilling over into the neighboring streets. There were no elite venture capitalists or arrogant socialites demanding VIP treatment. The crowd was filled with working-class families, local artists, neighborhood elders, and people who genuinely understood the deep, profound value of authentic, soulful food. I did not hire a Michelin-starred chef from Paris to run the kitchen. I partnered with a highly talented local black chef who had lost her previous business to aggressive corporate gentrification. I handed her the keys to the state-of-the-art kitchen, and she treated Cora's recipes with the absolute reverence they deserved. The air outside the restaurant was thick with the mouth-watering aroma of southern spices, a beautiful, fragrant reminder of the woman who had sacrificed everything for a family that ultimately betrayed her. I stood inside the bustling dining room surrounded by genuine laughter, the clinking of heavy ceramic plates, and the vibrant energy of a community coming together. I wore a simple, clean apron over my clothes, walking from table to table, pouring sweet tea and greeting the patrons. I was not pretending to be a billionaire, and I was not hiding my roots. I was a retired mechanic, proudly serving the exact peasant food my son had so arrogantly despised. The establishment was alive with a vibrant, authentic heartbeat that no amount of dirty corporate capital could ever artificially manufacture. As the afternoon lunch rush reached its peak, I walked toward the front of the restaurant to officially cut the ceremonial grand opening ribbon. I was flanked by Mr. Hayes, Mr. Klein, and the new head chef, all of whom had become my true circle of trusted allies. The diverse crowd gathered outside cheered loudly as the heavy brass scissors sliced cleanly through the thick red ribbon marking the official rebirth of my family's heritage. It was a moment of absolute, pristine triumph. But as the joyful applause echoed through the lively street, my eyes caught a sudden flash of bright neon orange moving slowly along the opposite sidewalk. The local county corrections department frequently assigned nonviolent federal inmates to weekend roadside cleanup crews, allowing them to shave a few days off their sentences through grueling manual labor. Shuffling painstakingly along the concrete, dragging a heavy plastic garbage bag behind him, was DeAndre. He was wearing an oversized, heavily stained orange jumpsuit with the bold black letters of the federal penitentiary printed across his hunched back. His physical recovery from the brutal beating he had suffered at the hands of the Shadowlenders was far from complete. He was heavily reliant on a pair of thick metal forearm crutches, awkwardly maneuvering his shattered pinned legs with every agonizing step. In one hand he held a cheap metal grabber tool, using it to pick up discarded fast food wrappers and cigarette butts from the filthy gutter. He looked completely exhausted, his face gaunt and covered in a thick layer of grime and sweat. He paused his humiliating labor, leaning heavily against his metal crutches to catch his breath. He slowly lifted his heavy head and looked across the busy street directly at the brightly lit, bustling storefront of Chorus Soul. He watched the massive, joyful crowd celebrating the opening of a wildly successful business built entirely on the very legacy he had aggressively tried to throw away. He saw the roaring, undeniable success that could have been his if he had simply possessed a shred of loyalty, respect, and common decency toward his own mother. Through the large, pristine glass windows of the newly renovated restaurant, our eyes finally met across the busy divide of the street. DeAndre froze entirely, his shoulders slumping under the crushing, unbearable weight of his own monumental failure. He looked at me, standing confidently, surrounded by genuine friends, a thriving community, and the undeniable triumph of his mother's resurrected legacy. His face crumbled, a look of absolute profound devastation washing over his exhausted, dirt-streaked features. He opened his mouth slightly as if wanting to call out to bridge the massive, insurmountable chasm he had selfishly created between us. I stood completely still, holding his desperate, broken gaze through the transparent glass. I did not offer him a warm, forgiving smile. I did not frown with lingering sadness or gloat with vindictive pleasure. I felt absolutely nothing. The space in my heart that used to hold unconditional love for my son was completely empty, replaced by an impenetrable shield of cold, absolute closure. I reached out and grabbed the thick fabric cord of the heavy velvet window blinds. Without breaking eye contact for a single second, I pulled the cord smoothly and deliberately. The thick, heavy curtains slid completely shut, blocking out the street, the garbage, and the tragic broken man standing in the gutter. The machine was permanently fixed. The legacy was completely secured, and the curtain was permanently closed on the traitor forever. The greatest tragedy in this story is not the loss of wealth, but the loss of self. When you cut off your roots to fit into a world that only values your compliance, you build your kingdom on sand. DeAndre believed that erasing his mother's legacy and adopting the hollow arrogance of high society would earn him respect. Instead, he became a disposable tool for their greed. True power does not come from designer suits or elite social circles. It comes from knowing exactly who you are, honoring the sacrifices of your ancestors, and having the quiet integrity to walk away from tables where respect is no longer served. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what you would have done if you were in my position.